The young man shouted at the young lady that everything happened because of her, and that she was also to blame for Melissa's death. The young lady froze in shock. She didn't understand what he was talking about. She came closer to her enraged husband and asked what he was talking about. She froze in shock and asked him if Melissa was dead. The young man shouted furiously that Melissa's husband, the Marquis, was to blame for her death. He shouted that the Marquis had not only destroyed the Roubier family through high treason, but had also killed his own wife. The young lady froze in shock. She didn't expect to hear something like that. She fell to the ground because she didn't believe her husband's words. She knew that Marquee was not that cruel. The man looked at his wife and called her. He looked at her and said that Melissa had taken her place. He looked intently at his wife and said that it was all because of her, since she had refused to marry the Marquis. The young lady was shocked by what she heard. She screamed and called her husband. She looked at her husband with tears in her eyes, as she had always loved only him. She wanted to be only his wife, so she refused marriage with the Marquis. He looked closely at his wife and said that it had to be her. He grabbed her in anger and shouted that she was out of place now. He didn't understand why everything turned out this way. He shouted at his wife and asked her why she was in front of him and not Melissa. The young lady with tears in her eyes asked her husband to stop. A moment later, servants came and pulled Tero away from the young lady. Goyo looked at her husband, wondering if he would have wanted her to die instead of Melissa. Melissa was her half-sister, the daughter of her stepmother from her father's second marriage. Even before her marriage to her husband, she knew that he was not indifferent to her. She hoped in her heart that these were just fleeting feelings that would disappear with time. She was in shock, and if she had known that this would happen, she would not have married him. The young lady blamed herself for her sister's death. The maid brought wine to the young lady's bath. She thanked the maid and also asked where her husband was. The maid said that his lordship had returned to work, so he would be back late. Goyo sighed heavily and said that she understood. She told the maid to leave and also not to let anyone into the room without permission. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that her husband already had another woman, and she was very similar to Melissa. Goyo knew perfectly well that his new lover would console him so that she could leave without regrets. She drank the poison and slowly passed away into another world, unfortunately, with tears on her face. She said goodbye to her husband, as he very much wanted her to die. The maid looked at the young lady and told her to wake up already. Goyo Z was frozen in shock. She didn't understand where she was and wondered if she was dead. She looked at the maid and asked what she was doing here. The young lady froze in shock as she realized that this was her room. She was confused and did not understand what was happening. A moment later, the man entered her room and asked if she was awake yet. The young lady froze in shock as she could not believe what she was seeing. She looked closely at her father and called out to him in surprise. She was in shock and didn't understand what was happening, as she knew that her father had died long ago. The young lady sat quietly sipping tea. A few days after her return, she did not understand what had happened. She woke up in time. She was never 22 years old before the destruction of Roubier, before her marriage to Terios. She woke up before Melissa's marriage to Betelgeuse. She knew that if she really did go back in time, she would do things completely differently this time. The young man looked at her intently and thanked her for accepting his proposal. She said with a smile that there was no need to thank her, as it was an honor for her. She looked intently at the young man who had destroyed her family and would kill her if she married him. She knew there was no room for hope, and since death was awaiting her anyway, she wanted to jump into the center of events. She wanted to try to live a life a little better than the last, before the day of her death, at the hands of the Marquis came. Goyo told Theriot that he seemed to think that after the engagement was called off, they would remain friends. Goyo looked at him intently and said that she was no longer his bride nor his lover. Goyo said that she was not his friend either. Theriot froze in shock. He did not expect this. Goyo calmly said that he was now Melissa's fiancé. She told him to behave properly, at least for Melissa's sake. The young man froze in shock, not knowing what to say, as such news was a shock to him. Goyo did, upon returning, was break off her engagement to Theriot. Goyo was surprised, as she had broken off relations with him so easily. Such a small thing had brought her a lot of suffering. She looked at him intently and said that she really hoped that he would not come to her again for personal reasons. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He looked at her with fury and asked if it was true that she had agreed to the Marquise's proposal. He asked the young lady if the Marquise had forced her to. She sighed heavily and said that it had nothing to do with the Marquise. He asked what the problem was then, because he knew that this was not what she had dreamed of. He shouted that one could not find happiness in a marriage of convenience. He said angrily that she had always wanted a loving family. She said he knew this, but still wanted her sister. She said that their relationship was over and asked him to stay out of her sight. He shouted at her that she must think it over again because she must understand what a political marriage means without love. He screamed that he didn't want her to go through this. Goyo said that love was not her priority. She said that she was not getting any younger and that she had better hurry up and get married quickly. She said that no one would give her love. She looked at him intently and said that he had no need to worry, because even if she had 100 lives, she would not marry him. He looked at her intently and said that he understood everything and also told her to marry him, and he would break off the engagement with Melissa. A moment later, the Marquis entered and said with a grin that he had found himself in an awkward situation. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect to see the Marquis Tero ask the Marquise with rage how he dared to enter the room. The Marquis looked at the young man and said that he had come to visit his fiancée. He asked if permission was really needed for that. Goyo said she was a little surprised that the Marquis had come unannounced. The Marquis said he was surprised that he needed the former's permission to meet her. Tero was furious. He looked at the Marquis and in a fit of anger shouted at him. The Marquis looked at the young man with a grin and said that he had a lot to discuss with his bride. He used magic and directed it at Tero. Tero was furious. He did not understand why the Marquis came to the lady. He screamed, but the Marquis did not give up. A moment later, the Marquis used his magic and sent the young man off to get his bearings. The young lady froze in shock as the young man disappeared. She looked at the Marquis and asked what he had done. Marquis said with a smile that he sent him to a picturesque place to cool off a bit, and since he was a very skilled knight, he would come back without any problem. She asked in surprise if it was really a teleport. She said that he was really good at magic. The Marquis said with a smile that it was just a simple spell. He came closer to her and said with a smile that she could call him by his name. He said that she called her ex by his name, and this fact upsets him. She timidly said that he was just her childhood friend. The Marquis asked her why she decided to break off the engagement. The lady said that Tero liked her sister, and that is why she decided to break off the relationship. The Marquis sighed and said that the young man himself had broken the agreement. He did not understand why he interfered in her relationship after all. She said with a smile that she also didn't know what he was thinking, but it didn't matter. The Marquis looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she spoke correctly. Goyo in turn looked intently at the Marquis as he gave her a radiant smile. The young man froze in shock. He did not understand where he was. He was furious because the Marquis sent him to an unknown place. A moment later, he heard an angry reek behind him. He turned around and froze in shock as he saw a large monster behind him. But after some time, he easily defeated him and sat down to look at a map of the area. Tero was furious as he found himself in the Avalanche Mountains, a place that the royal family had declared forbidden, as the mountains were home to monsters. 3 weeks later, the young lady's wedding took place. She was marrying Betelgeuse. The madame came closer to the young lady and asked if she was ready as the celebration was about to take place. The young lady was taken aback when she saw her mother and sister. She was surprised that her sister had also come. Madame said that the Marquis's influence was truly great, since the proposal was only 3 weeks old, and a magnificent wedding was already in preparation. Melissa looked closely at her sister and timidly congratulated her on her wedding. She smiled and wished her sister a happy and long marriage. Goyo thanked her sister for her congratulations, and also said that her wedding would take place next year, and she would hardly be able to attend it. Melissa looked at her sister intently and said that she had a lot of things to do in the future, so there would be no time to celebrate. Melissa looked at her sister and asked if there was still no news from Sir Tero. The young lady stood there in bewilderment. She asked if he hadn't returned from the mountains, yet Melissa said that he had sent a message that he would be staying for a short time. Goyo sighed heavily and said that he had not contacted her. Melissa sighed heavily and said that it was very dangerous in the mountains. She looked at her sister intently and asked why he decided to train in a place like this. Goyo sighed and said that she didn't know. Sometime later, the solemn wedding ceremony took place. The priest looked closely at the young people and asked if the bride swears her love to the groom until death. The young lady glanced sideways at the young Marquise, for she knew what awaited her next. A moment later, she looked at him and said that she swears, and the Marquise looked at her with a smile. After a while, he hugged her tenderly and kissed her hard. The young lady stood on the deck of the ship and stared into the distance, thinking about what had happened. A moment later, the Marquis approached her and looked at her with a smile while he wrapped her in his jacket. She looked at him intently and said in surprise that he was very caring. He said with a smile that it could not be otherwise since she was his wife. The young lady froze in place after she heard him say that she was his wife. He looked at her with a smile and said that she was now Madame Goyo Betelgeuse. Goyo sighed heavily and said with a smile that she was not yet used to it. She thought for a moment, because she knew that in her past life, her husband had never been Alta. It seemed to her that he didn't consider her his wife, and simply called her Goyo Rubiette. The Marquise looked at her intently and asked with a smile why she did not become a duchess. The young lady froze in place. She did not know what to answer. She said that it did not suit her since she was not very good at small talk. He looked at her closely and asked what she dreamed of. She smiled and said that she would like to have a loving family. Goyo said that she saw her parents' marriage, in which there was not a drop of happiness, and she dreamed of marrying her beloved. She said that she would like to start a family with him and have children, and also have a normal life with him. She looked sideways at her husband with a smile and asked if her dream was really boring. He looked at her hard and said that was not true at all. He said that he understood her perfectly and knew how difficult it was for people in their position to find such a thing. She said that was true, that was why she gave in. She said that she no longer had a dream, but her heart was calmer. She looked at her husband and asked what he dreamed about. He looked at her intently and said that he dreamed of power. The young lady froze in shock. He said that he dreams of absolute power so that no one would interfere with him, and this goal is more important to him than 1,000 lives. Goyo in turn froze in place, not uttering a word. But a moment later, he looked at her with a smile and said that he was joking, because now he just wanted to enjoy family life. She looked at him sideways and said with a grin that his dream would soon come true. Ansi Betelgeuse destroyed the Rubiette family, one of the two ducal families. Being the illegitimate son of the previous emperor, he received the title of Archduke. He was quite capable and experienced, and no one even dared to mention that he was just an illegitimate child. She believed that nothing would change, and by the time his dream came true, she would already be dead. He looked at her intently and asked if they were going to have a good honeymoon. She looked intently at her husband, who smiled back at her, but said nothing to him. He said with a smile that even if he did not give her love, he would cherish her as much as possible. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she should believe him. He slowly approached her to kiss her. The young lady said that she believed that he would not give her love. They merged in a passionate kiss. She hoped that he would not love her, since she no longer wanted to trust something so unreliable. People froze in shock as they looked at the young knight, as he was in a shabby state. The women looked intently at the young man. They did not understand what had happened to him. They wondered if he had fallen into a ditch. They couldn't understand how he could walk around looking like that. The lady took her son away from the man because he smelled very bad. Tero came to the Rubiette estate. He was very angry. He ran up to the young man and hastily asked who he was and how he dared to enter their presence looking like that. He looked at the knight intently and said with fury that he had conveyed that Tero Alte is back. The Marquis looked closely at his assistant from his seat. Had Tero already returned? XRS told the gentleman that he had heard that he had returned. The Marquis sighed as the young man returned, and sooner than he expected, he said he should have thrown it away. The Marquis looked hard at his assistant and told him not to let his wife know about this. He looked closely at the gentleman and said that he seemed to care very much about his wife. The Marquis said that the young lady was now his wife and the mistress of this estate. He looked closely at his subordinate and told him not to dare to say more, just that the young man asked for forgiveness. Exer looked at the gentleman and said that perhaps his words would sound inappropriate. He said that he did not know the young lady, but she seemed very honest. The Marquis angrily told him not to bother his head with useless things and to get down to business. He sighed heavily as he realized that nothing had changed. The young lady looked at the garden in surprise. She was amazed by its beauty. The Marquis, in turn, watched his wife closely. He asked with a smile if she liked the garden. She said with a smile that she liked everything, and that it was as if she was looking at a meadow with jewels. He asked in surprise if she didn't like bright things. He said that he hadn't even thought about it, and he should have asked her opinion first. She said with a smile that the brightness of the roses was a little overwhelming, but she didn't hate them. She smiled and said that the gardener must have tried very hard, the Marquis said, with a smile that it was his little hobby. She asked in surprise if he had really created the garden himself. She didn't know that such a thing was possible with the help of magic. He said with a smile that magic can make dreams come true and attack someone depending on the desire of the caster. He looked at her with a smile and asked if he should teach her magic. The young lady looked at him in surprise. A moment later, she said sadly that unfortunately she couldn't use it. She said that she tried for a long time as a child, but no matter how much money and time she spent on it, everything was to no avail. She looked at him intently and said that, unfortunately, she didn't think she could learn. The Marquis said with a smile that a man can never be sure that he is capable. He smiled and said that her teachers would have the best poppy in the world. He asked what else she had to worry about. The young lady smiled, looking at her husband, and said that she would certainly think about it, and also thanked him for his advice. The Marquis led the young lady to her bedroom, and also told her that the room was on the 4th floor, and she could use the portal. The young lady was amazed that the portal was inside the mansion, and she found it very convenient. He smiled and said that this was the magician's estate. She looked at her husband in surprise and said, "You have one bed in the room." She asked where his bedroom was. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really didn't want to live in the same room with him. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something convenient. A moment later, she was taken aback and timidly said that it was not so. In her past life, she and her husband had separate rooms, and for this reason, she thought it was normal. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she minded sharing a bedroom. The young lady said she didn't mind. Goyo understood perfectly well that it was normal for a married couple to share a bed. Goyo looked at him sharply and said that she had no intention of avoiding her marital duties, but she did not want to rush into having children. He looked at her with embarrassment and said that he thought the same as she did. She said that she would then take birth control pills. He looked at her intently and said that there was no need for that, as the pills had side effects. He looked at her intently and said that they were having a political marriage anyway, so they could take their time. He came closer to her and said that it was better to avoid anything that could harm her health. The young lady froze in shock and looked at him intently, asking if he was telling the truth. The young lady looked at him intently and said that it was very good that they had talked about everything. Before returning to the past, the Marquis's assistant told him that Goyo had died. The Marquis froze in shock and asked if it was true. Exer said the lady died of a heart attack and was said to have used silver bell extract to lower her blood pressure. He said the problem was with the contraceptive drugs, as the combination of drugs produced a side effect. He looked at the Marquis intently and said that few people in Depeche had heard of this. The assistant told the Marquis that it was an accident and he was very sorry. The Marquis angrily told him to stop saying such things, as it could not have been an accident. The Marquis said that before her marriage, her mother's name was Asla Valverde, and she comes from Dopes. The Marquis said that the lady had decided to leave just like her mother. He sighed heavily and said that he had mixed up all the cards. The Marquis said that her body should be taken first, as it was very lucky that she chose this method. Exer looked at the gentleman and asked if he thought that they would give him the body so easily. The Marquis said that it must be taken at any cost. Tero, with tears in his eyes, screamed at his late wife, begging her to wake up and not leave him. The Marquis looked at the young man and asked why he had not taken care of her before it was too late. Marquee told him that he had neglected her before and was extremely disappointed with him. The Marquis looked at Tero with contempt. He did not understand why Tero was now grieving. Tero looked at the measurements and the backside with fury and shouted at him. A moment later, he drew his sword and presented it to the Marquis's throat. He shouted that he, the Marquis, was involved in the destruction of her family. He did not understand how he dared to come here. The young man screamed with cold. He wanted the Marquis to go away. A moment later, Marquee blocked his attack with magic. The young man looked at the Marquess with fury. He did not understand why he had come to them. The Marquis said with a grin that he would leave here only with the body of the young lady. Tero looked at the Marquis with anger and asked what he was saying. He shouted at him that he himself did not understand what he was doing. Tero shouted at the Marquis not to even dare touch her, since the Alte family would not remain on the sidelines. The Marquis said with a grin that it wouldn't matter, since they wouldn't bother him. He looked closely at the young lady's body and said that he was very sorry about what had happened, but he had no other choice. A moment later, he used his magic with a smile, and the young lady's body began to float in the air. Tero was furious. He shouted at the Marquis not to dare take the lady away from him. The Marquis looked at the young man with a grin and said that he should have thought about everything earlier. The Marquis said that unlike him, he always keeps his word using his magic. He teleported with the body. The young lady shared a bed with her husband and was a little puzzled because she could not sleep. The young lady glanced sideways at her husband, wondering if he was sleeping. She had never shared a bed with anyone before, and it felt strange. She couldn't take a deep breath for fear that he would hear. She thought for a moment, because she knew that in her past life, she had never spent the night with her husband, even though they were lovers. She knew that the Marquis's politeness was just a mask, but it was not a problem for her. She only hoped that he would not throw it off until the very end. The Marquis in turn sighed heavily, since he also could not sleep. He glanced sideways at his wife, as he understood that it was very difficult for her to fall asleep. He looked at her closely, as he had previously thought that she had been tossing and turning all night. The Marquis slowly stood up and left the room as he had business to attend to. The man sighed heavily as light suddenly poured down on him. He looked at the door in surprise and confusion and asked who had entered. The Marquis looked closely at the Count and asked if he remembered him. The Count was shocked. He asked if it was really the Prince of Annecy himself. Annecy moved closer to the Count and said with a grin that it must be difficult for him to call an illegitimate child a prince. He looked at the Count and said with a grin that he would now introduce himself again. He said with a grin that his name was Annecy Betelgeuse. The Count was shocked and asked him if he was really the Marquis of Annecy Betelgeuse. The Marquis looked closely at the bed and said with a grin that everything was correct. He said that being from birth a simple man, but he tried to curry favor, quickly gained fame, and received the title of Marquis. He looked at the Count with a grin and said that he had become what he was now. The Count shouted that this was simply absurd, since the prince had sold him into slavery. The Marquis said that everything was correct, and the name of the person who bought it was Valverde. The Count was in shock and shouted that this simply couldn't be. The Marquis looked at the Count with a grin and said that he had probably already heard about them. The Marquis said that he is the head of the clan, can control the whole world with 3 fingers, and holds a share of the underground capital in his hands. The Marquis glanced sideways at his assistant and said, "Exer, his representative." The Count was surprised and puzzled, as he did not know that Valverde was involved in the matter. The Marquis looked at the Count intently and asked if he understood the situation he was in. The Count shouted that he knew nothing. Looking at the Marquis, he said that Rubiet was to blame for everything. The Marquis looked at the Count with a grin and asked if he was really saying now that he knew nothing. The Marquis asked from whom then did the Empress receive information about the illegitimate child. Was it also from the Rubies? The Marquis said furiously that she had secretly supported the second prince and the first prince, and the Rubies decided to do everything quietly. He said with fury that she then learned about the illegitimate child. He asked who told her about it. The Marquis wanted to know where Mazel was. The Count in turn understood that he was now in a hopeless situation. He said that the young man was already dead. The Marquis looked at the Count with fury and said that he still had many teeth left. The Marquis said that if he killed him, he would never know where Mazel was. He shouted that he simply wanted to destroy Elysia out of jealousy, so he told everything to the Empress. The Marquis looked at the Count with fury and asked how he dared to call his mother, that the Marquis told the Count to speak more respectfully. The Count was shocked. He shouted that he did not deserve such abuse. He said that the Marquis was able to achieve his position because he sold him to Valverde. The Count shouted that he was now a Marquis, but he could have spent his whole life in the shadows. He did not understand why the Marquis was behaving so vilely. The Marquis looked at the man with fury and said that the title of Marquis was not enough for him. The Count looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Marquis said that he had always been looked down upon. Now he wanted to repay the debt. He shouted that he wanted to become a duke. He looked at the Count with a grin and said that this was not even his final goal. He looked at the Count intently and said that with such a title, he could enter the fight for the throne. He said with a grin that he would succeed if there were no direct descendants left. The Count furiously shouted at the Marquess that he was simply mad. The Count shouted that this was treason. The Marquis said with a grin that this was just the legal order of succession to the throne. A moment later, the Marquis drew his sword, and looking at the Count, said that he was giving him one last chance. He looked at the Count with fury and asked where the traitor Mazel was. The Count, trembling with fear and looking at the Marquis, said that he was in Albret. He boarded the ship and headed for the port of Porcendo. The Marquis slowly handed his sword to his assistant. Everyone looked at the Marquis in bewilderment. As he was leaving, the Marquis told his assistant to kill the Count. The Count was shocked, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Looking after the Marquis, he trembled with fear and, taken aback, shouted to the Marquis to stop. A moment later, a terrible cry thundered in the dungeon. XRP looked at the gentleman and said that he killed the Count. He thought that the gentleman would do it himself. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that he couldn't stand the smell of blood. He glanced sideways at his assistant and said that his wife had a keen charm. The young man looked at his master intently and asked in confusion if he was really going to take the throne. Marquee said that he was not sure yet. He said that his whole life he had only tried to be better than everyone else, in the hope that it would fill his heart a little. The Marquis said that no one in this empire would share his opinion, and whether he became an emperor or even a tyrant, he would be overthrown in any case. XRP looked at the gentleman and called him. The Marquis said that he was not destined to find happiness, and nothing would change if he became the ruler. The Marquis said that he was not going to do anything otherwise. No one would even notice that he existed. He said he had no other choice, only his promise to Chloe, which he was holding on to. He looked closely at his assistant and asked about the information about Tero Alta. The aide said the ducal title originally belonged to his mother, but after her death, the title passed to her husband. The assistant said that the young man had led a quiet life. The Marquis froze as he saw interesting information. The assistant said that Tero has a younger brother, and he is now 18 years old. He is also not lacking in talent, so he can become the heir. Exer asked the gentleman if he was really planning to remove the head of the Alter family. The Marquis said he was thinking about it. He knew that a change of heir would help him in his plan. The Marquis looked at the information about his family in surprise and noticed a photograph of Tero's mother. He looked at her closely, as she looked very much like his wife. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that his wife was 100 times more beautiful. For a moment he thought, as he now understood, why the young man was so attached to his wife. The young lady stood to the side while all the children were having fun and getting to know each other. A moment later, she was taken aback and turned around as she heard someone calling her. She froze in surprise as she saw her friend. He smiled and asked her for forgiveness for being late. She looked at him intently and asked if her outfit didn't look very strange, since he was the one who chose this outfit. He looked at her in surprise and said with a smile that she looked very cute, since the modest things suited her perfectly. The young lady looked away from him in embarrassment, but did not answer. She felt a little sad because everyone else was wearing fashionable dresses. She wanted to wear something simpler, but she was embarrassed by the extra attention. He looked at her and said with a smile that his mother also liked such outfits. He said that his family was knightly, so he hated fancy clothes. She timidly said that liking beautiful things was not something bad. He said with a smile that she was beautiful, even in simple clothes. She asked shyly if it was true. Tero Wu smiled and said it was. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she could promise him something. Tero X wanted her to promise him that she would only wear such things in the future. He looked at her intently and said that she didn't need to wear fancy dresses, as these outfits suited her better. The young lady froze in shock. She didn't hate luxury. She just didn't want extra attention. She froze, not knowing what to answer. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she was already beautiful. He gave her a beaming smile and asked if they had come to an agreement. A moment later, the young lady changed into the Lyceum and, sighing heavily, said what she promised. He smiled and said that she had made him a promise. He looked at her with fury and asked why she broke the promise she made to him. The young lady was taken aback, looking at her friend. She did not understand what was happening. A moment later, he was strangling her with fury and asking why she had married the Marquis. He was shouting that luxury did not suit her. He choked her and told her to wear simple clothes. He asked her furiously why she did not keep her word. He shouted that he loved only Melissa, but he married her because of her stubbornness. He was furious because she left him and married another. He screamed that she couldn't do this to him, and he promised to make her unhappy. He screamed that she should return to him. Goyo, in turn, screamed that she did not want to return to him. She woke up shaking. I sighed heavily because she had a nightmare. A moment later, she came to her senses as she realized that it was just a dream. The Marquis looked at his wife in surprise and asked if she had woken up. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise. He asked if she had had a nightmare and also apologized for not waking her up earlier. She sighed heavily and said that everything was fine. A moment later, he moved closer to her and hugged her tightly. The young lady froze in bewilderment. The Marquis said kindly that she could push him away if she was against it. The young lady froze in place. She did not push him away but hugged him in return. Trembling, she said that she had dreamed of Tero Goyo, was excited, but knew she had to tell him about it. She said he tried to strangle her and asked why she had not kept her promise. The young lady said in fear that it all looked very natural, and she was scared the Marquis was furious. He said that he would have to do the same to him when they met. The young lady said in surprise that it was just a nightmare. He looked at her closely and said that she was in pain. The Marquis said that the guy had committed a crime. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he was joking. A moment later, the Marquis brought her hot tea to calm her down. She looked at him in surprise and thanked him. Milady sighed heavily as she felt much better now. She wondered if it was all thanks to her husband. A moment later, the young lady called her husband Goyo, glanced out of the window, and asked him not to destroy the rose garden. He froze in surprise because he didn't understand why she suddenly started talking about this. He looked hard at his wife and said that he thought she didn't like the garden. She looked at her husband with a smile and said that she would try to love them. She said that Tero said that modest things suited her, so she refused everything fancy. Goyo said that she could like pretentious things too. She sighed heavily and said that she avoided such things because she was not used to it. Ansi looked at his wife intently and said that she shouldn't listen to that guy. For a moment, the young lady froze as she remembered her promise. She wondered what was the point of keeping her word if he hadn't kept it first. She ran away from him. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that her ex-husband would be very angry after this incident. Melissa looked at Tero with a smile and asked if he had already returned. She said that they had not seen each other for a long time. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it had really been that long. She smiled and said that it had. The young man looked closely at the young lady as her dress was similar to his sister's. It was the first time he had seen her in such an outfit. He knew that this outfit suited him the most. The young lady looked at him and called out. She asked why he came. She wondered if he really wanted to see her sister. He sighed heavily and said that it was not so, and he could no longer think about the fate of a man who, out of stupidity, married someone he had not known for a month. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he would like to call off their engagement. She froze in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that his head had been in a mess lately. Looking at the young lady, he said that he had a feeling that he needed to train more. She froze, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, she looked at him and said that she understood him. She looked at him with a smile and said that it was not urgent anyway. He looked at her sideways and said that it was all true and that he was a little busy today, so he should leave already. The young lady looked at him intently, but a moment later rushed towards him and asked him to wait. She said her mother would be back soon and asked if he wanted to meet her before she left. Tero looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression, but a moment later said that he had urgent business and asked for forgiveness. He slowly came closer to her and kissed her on the cheek. The lady was shocked, but did not answer. A moment later, he said that it was time for him to go and left. She froze in place, looking after him. She was furious because she knew she wouldn't even look at this piece of trash if it wasn't from the Alt family. She wiped her cheek in a hurry. A moment later, she turned around because she heard someone calling her. She looked at her mother in surprise, who had just arrived at the estate. The lady looked at her daughter with fury and said that they needed to talk. Looking at her daughter, she asked if she could come in to see her for a while. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was already on her way. The maid looked at her mistress with a smile on her face and asked if she had already woken up. She asked the lady how her trip had gone. The young lady smiled and said that everything went well, and also asked the maid if she had transferred to them. The maid smiled and said that everything was fine and that she had been promised double her salary. A moment later, she was taken aback because she had let it slip. The young lady smiled and said that was very good. She asked the lady if she would like to have breakfast in the garden, as that was what the gentleman had asked. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise. The maid said with a smile that she heard that they had prepared something simple. The young lady wondered for a moment whether the flowers would be too fragrant, but the maid said with a smile that it was just fine outside. Looking at Goyo, she asked how about Togo to admire the beautiful view. The young lady in turn knew that she had decided to try all the exquisite things she wanted to do as her husband told her. She looked at the maid with a smile and said that they could go into the garden right away. The young lady stood frozen in place after she entered the garden. She looked closely at her husband and said that she thought there would be a strong scent of flowers, but she did not smell anything. He said with a smile that it was magic. The young lady was surprised because she didn't know that such a thing was possible. He smiled and said that it was easier to answer, which was impossible for him. She said with a smile that he could not be modest. He said with a smile that she was smart. The young lady froze in place as she saw her interesting dishes on the table. She looked at the prepared breakfast with bewilderment. She said that for a sandwich, the presentation was a bit strange. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was a beautiful and fancy sandwich, just as she herself had said yesterday. He smiled and said that he had experimented a little and tried to decorate the food. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this was really his work. The young lady froze in place as she wondered if he had done this for her himself. A moment later, she plucked up her courage and decided to try the dish he had prepared for her. The young lady froze in place because the sandwich was so delicious. She was amazed because he cooked very well. He smiled and said that the sandwich was made by the chef, but he just decorated it. The young lady smiled and said that she understood everything and now took her words back. For some time, they sat quietly in the garden and enjoyed the beautiful view. The Marquis looked at his wife and called her. He asked, looking at his wife, how about learning magic? She said that unfortunately she lacks confidence because there is nothing she is good at. She didn't know if she could do it. He looked at her in surprise, but then said with a smile that if it was interesting, then she should challenge it. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she could do whatever she wanted. The young lady looked at him in surprise. A moment later, she smiled and said that they could visit then. He asked if she wanted to try it. Now the young lady was surprised, as she didn't expect it to happen so quickly. He looked at his wife with a smile and said that she just had to listen to him carefully. The rest looked at her and said that first, he would like to tell a short digression. He said that each person has his own attribute, and the attribute in turn is based on talent. He began to describe everything to her in detail. He asked if she understood it. The young lady in turn froze for a moment, but a moment later, taken aback, she said that her confidence had disappeared. She asked if it was still possible to refuse. He with a smile apologized and said that he had made things difficult on purpose since she was very sweet when she was confused. She looked at her in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She wondered if he was making fun of her again. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that everything was being explained to her more simply now. He smiled and said that besides talent, something else was needed since the trick was to transform the image into form. He looked at her intently and said that he would show her another way, since it was more like creating a template that transforms the formula. He smiled and said that this is often called fortitude. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Marquis looked at his wife with a smile and said that she was not difficult to control, and if there was even a little imagination, that she could easily cope with it. He said that for this certain emotions were needed to release her. Goyo looked at him in surprise and asked if emotions were really necessary. The Marquis looked closely at his wife and said that it was so. He said that, unfortunately, the necessary strong negative emotions, since this is given to happy people, much more difficultly. He handed her a certain object. A moment later, the Marquis looked closely at his wife and said with a smile that she could try it once. The young lady slowly touched the artifact and a light illuminated her. A moment later, she noticed that the hand on the clock began to spin chaotically. She looked at her husband in surprise and asked if he thought she could do it. The Marquis looked away into the distance and was silent for a while. A moment later, he looked at her with a sharp gaze and said that, unfortunately, everyone has their own problems. She thought for a moment as she remembered her problems. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she was showing a strong reaction to the manna, and that this was a very good sign. He smiled and said that he would now add some of his magic to the artifact. She asked anxiously if this was the special feeling he had spoken of earlier. Ansi looked at the young lady intently and said that fire is fear and earth is loneliness. The Marquis said that the wind is fury, and there is also water. A moment later, they were enveloped in water magic. Goyo was shocked as she had never seen anything like it before. The young lady froze in shock as she did not expect to see something like this. She asked her husband if it really worked. The Marquis smiled and said that everything worked out, and she summoned the spirit of water, but he didn't think that everything would work out so easily. He looked at his wife intently and told her to present the form, since, in this form, he would soon disappear. He looked at her intently and said that she could present anything but something specific. The young lady was alarmed, as it was very unexpected. But having collected her thoughts, she imagined what she wanted to see. The Marquis looked at him in surprise, the spirit of water, because he saw that he was already transforming into form. A moment later, a beautiful dolphin appeared in front of them. The young lady was amazed by the beauty, as she did not expect to see anything like that at all. She smiled and said that she had done it, and it was just wonderful. He smiled and said that she could give it a name. She looked at her husband and asked if she really needed to come up with a name. She said that it was a lot of trouble. He smiled and said that if she wanted to study physics with him instead, she didn't have to name him. She looked at him sideways and wondered what name to choose. The young lady looked closely at her new friend and went through different names in her head. A moment later, she finally decided on a name, and looking at her husband, said that she called him Vodin. A few minutes later, she clearly said his name, and he began to transform. After a few minutes of transformation, the dolphin appeared in all its glory before the young people. For a few more minutes, he cruised past them, but a moment later, he was gone. The young lady was surprised that he had disappeared so quickly. The Marquis looked at his wife and said with a smile that he appears when she calls his name. He smiled and congratulated her, since she met a spirit for the first time, and it is a great honor. The young lady with a pale face looked at her husband and asked if it was true. A moment later, she lost consciousness and slowly fell. The Marquis was in shock, as he did not expect anything like this. With lightning speed, he caught his wife and quietly asked if she was okay. The young lady in turn thanked her husband for catching her when her legs suddenly gave way. He looked at her excitedly and said that summoning a spirit takes a lot of energy. He said tenderly that she should rest now, and that he would take her there. She smiled and said that she could go herself or ask the servants. He smiled, looking at his wife, and said that he might be jealous. The young lady sighed heavily and agreed with him. He smiled and said that she should hold on tighter. She looked at him in bewilderment, so she did not understand what he was talking about. A moment later, the Marquis lifted his wife into his arms with lightning speed and looked at her with a smile. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect such a thing. In a hurry, she asked him to stop. He looked at her with a smile and said that he would never get tired of admiring her embarrassed face. She called her husband in bewilderment and said that he had strange hobbies. She asked if it was all because of his character, and no one had wanted to date him before. He smiled, looking at his wife, and said that it could be so. He looked at her intently, knowing that summoning a spirit required a certain clear emotion. He was a little puzzled because he knew that fire meant fear, earth meant loneliness, and wind meant rage. He was puzzled and alarmed because he realized that his wife was overcome with despair. The Marquis sat and amused himself in his study by playing cards. A moment later, he felt the assistant's gaze on him and asked what had happened. Caleb looked at the gentleman intently and said that his wife's birthday was in January. Caleb said that unfortunately, the gentleman had not yet disposed of the gift. He looked at the gentleman intently and asked if he had forgotten his wife's birthday. A moment later, the Marquis's house of cards collapsed to the ground. The assistant froze in shock and, trembling, looked at the gentleman. The Marquis looked at his assistant with fury and said that he had not even offered any options. The assistant asked the gentleman if he had told his wife about his birthday. The Marquis said that his wife had no need to worry about it at all. He said that he still gets a lot of gifts from others. The assistant looked at the gentleman intently and said that that was not the problem. The Marquis in turn sighed heavily, but did not answer. A moment later, looking at his assistant, he asked what his opinion was of him and of his relationship with Goyo. Caleb thought for a moment, and looking at the gentleman, said that he was sentimental. A moment later, he said that the gentleman was even a little crazy. The Marquis laughed. The Marquis could barely contain his rage. He looked closely at his assistant and asked if he had really gone mad. The young man puzzledly asked his master to remove the fierce grin from his face. A moment later, Caleb collected his thoughts and decided to have a serious talk with the masters. He looked hard at the Marquis and said that he meant that he was a man who was madly in love with his wife. The Marquis was surprised, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He asked his assistant if he was really a loving man. Caleb looked closely at the gentleman and said that the wedding had already taken place, and he no longer needed to pretend. Caleb asked the master what the mistress would think if he continued to take care of her like this. He said that it might make her feel special. He asked the master to stop pretending. The Marquis looked at his assistant with a grin and asked if he was really saying that to make him calmer. The Marquis was puzzled and wondered what would happen if he suddenly changed his attitude towards her. He wondered how she would react to such a thing. He understood that she would definitely be surprised, but only at first. He knew that then she would close her heart and would constantly perform the duties of the Marquis. He knew that their relationship would never be the same as it was now. He understood perfectly well that later on, a dull married life would follow, and they will only say hello and goodbye. Unfortunately, he didn't like all of this. He understood perfectly well that then she would no longer call him by name and would hide her smile far from him. He sighed heavily and said that this would not happen. The young man looked at the gentleman in surprise, as he did not understand his reaction. For a moment he thought as he had never met anyone with such a gentle nature before. He understood that unfortunately, she was stingy with emotions, and that made her seem a little cruel. But he constantly saw the despair that she hid so deeply inside herself. He looked intently out of the window as he saw his beautiful wife in the garden. He had obsessive thoughts while looking at the young lady. He wanted to immediately grab her and hug her tightly and also kiss her passionately. The Marquis turned his gaze away from his wife. He sighed heavily and said with a gentle smile that this was not at all like him. Caleb looked at the gentleman intently and said that everything was correct, and it was very surprising that the same devil of the battlefield was capable of such a thing. He looked at the master with excitement and said that the allies were terrified by his mere glance. The Marquis turned around and looked intently at his assistant, who in turn shuddered. The Marquis looked at his assistant and asked if he often spoke ill of him like that. The young man looked at his master and asked for forgiveness, and also said that he was wrong. Caleb knew perfectly well that the master did not want to admit it, but he knew that he had better stop running away. He looked at the gentleman intently and wondered if he realized that he had looked like he was in love for a long time. Meanwhile, the young lady practiced incessantly with her new friend. She looked at him with a smile and said that he should put out the candle. Her friend slowly carried out the order. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing. A moment later, looking at her friend, she praised him with a smile. A moment later, she looked closely at her friend as he swirled into a whirlwind and disappeared. She collapsed onto the sofa and sighed heavily, as she knew that even a short call took a lot of energy. Goyo remembered that her husband said that it required a lot of concentration, as well as endurance. She sighed heavily, knowing that this was her limit for now. She thought for a moment and wondered what kind of feeling was required to summon her spirit. It was very interesting, but at the same time sad, since her husband said nothing. The young lady thought for a moment and remembered her husband. For the first time, he had made a completely different impression. But she understood perfectly well that he was the one who would kill her in the future. Tero was very angry before returning to the past, because something that belonged to him was taken away from him. He knew that the Grand Duke had come and taken the body of his wife. He was angry and knew that he had to find it, no matter what it cost him. And the knight looked at the gentleman intently and said that they would immediately catch the Duke, since he was heading for the mountains. He looked at the soldiers intently and said that the soldiers of the second level and below O would remain in the manor, and the special forces of the first level would go with him. The knights obediently carried out the master's order. Tero was furious and knew full well that he would immediately return his family member. Meanwhile, the Grand Duke was casting a spell next to the body of the young lady. He was focused on the spell, and everything was going as he wanted. The assistant looked at the gentleman intently, but he did not say anything to him since he knew that it was pointless. Looking at the gentleman, he said that it was simply impossible. He told the gentleman to think about it again, since there was no way to go back to the past. Ansi looked at his assistant and said that this is what he promised Chloe. He told his assistant to give his wife tried to stop him. The young man cried out to his master that the promise had been made in jest, and the young lady's mother was only a distant relative of Chloe's exer, T, cried out, "Lord, why had they never even met?" He did not understand how this promise could concern the one with whom they were simply the same blood. Ansi looked intently at his assistant and called him. He looked at the assistant with fury and said that if he did not understand how the young lady was connected with the promise, then he should simply keep quiet. Exer was furious because he understood that he would not be able to convince his master. He shouted that it was too great a sacrifice, but the young master did not hear him. Caleb in turn froze in place, listening to their dialogue. Caleb looked at Exer intently, as he knew that he did not understand the young master at all. Caleb approached the master and asked if his promise stated that if she chose her own path, he should not interfere with it. The young gentleman looked at the assistant in surprise and asked what he was doing here. Caleb sighed heavily and said that he did not come to stop him, since he would not listen to him anyway. Caleb said, looking at the gentleman, Tero had already begun to act. Ansi said with a grin that it seemed like he wasn't such a fool after all. Caleb looked at the gentleman and said that it was no problem if you turned back time, but it was a mistake not to cover your tracks. Exer, the man looked at the young men. He shouted that it was simply impossible. The assistant shouted to his master that if he turned back time, the soul would simply break into pieces. Caleb said that they did not know, and nothing like that would definitely happen to the soul of the young master. A moment later, he said that such a thing could happen, but only a little. Exer looked at the gentleman with fury. He was agitated and shouted that now was not the time to joke. He asked the young gentleman not to rush into such a decision. He asked the gentleman if he really wanted to give up everything he had achieved over the past 10 years. The Grand Duke said with a grin that at first he was angry about the failures, but now he knows that starting over is not so bad. The young man was shocked by such a statement. He did not expect to hear something like that from his master. The Grand Duke looked closely at his assistant and said that he knew that he was loyal to Chloe because she had saved him from slavery, and that was probably the reason why he was helping his successor. Ansi looked intently at his assistant and said with a smile that he knew his loyalty was to him. Exer O turned his gaze away from the gentleman and sighed heavily, as he understood that he would not be able to convince him. Ansi said that even Chloe didn't know that their promise was a magical contract, by which he couldn't let Goyo meet such a terrible end. Exer was shocked and didn't understand why it was necessary to make such a terrible contract. Ansi looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that they could call it childish naivety. Caleb stared at them but said nothing. Exer in turn screamed he did not understand why the young master had acted so recklessly. The assistant shouted to his master that breaking the terms of such a contract could result in death. The young master said with a grin that he was not dead, and there was a way back, so he was still alive. He said that if he had not been there, this situation would not have even arisen. The Grand Duke glanced sideways at his assistant and asked if he really thought it was so impossible. The young men looked intently at the Grand Duke. They did not answer him because they understood that he was right, and they could not convince him otherwise. He sighed heavily and said that he did not feel any sense of satisfaction after becoming a marquis and a duke. He said that this emptiness could not be filled even by receiving the throne. He smiled a soft smile at his subordinates and said that he had better leave it at that. A moment later, he finally finished the spell. He looked closely at the body in front of him and said with a smile that the time had come. Caleb walked slowly up to the gentleman and called him. He smiled and told the gentleman that his temper was so bad that he was completely exhausted. Caleb told his master that he had wanted to strangle him with his own hands many times. He smiled and told the gentleman that it was still a great honor to serve him, and they would see each other in the future. Ansi looked at his subordinate with a smile and said goodbye to him. A moment later, the spell began to take effect, but suddenly they heard a noise. Tero Z froze in place in shock as he saw his wife and the Grand Duke next to hers. He was furious because he saw the haughty grin of the Grand Duke. With lightning speed, he ran up to him in order to have time to take the young lady. But his attempts were in vain as the spell began to work, and so the hands of the clock turned back. The young man was drowning, going deeper and deeper. He looked into the distance as if he had seen light on the surface. Anasi Solaris, a child born under the witch moon on the day of the most powerful magic in the year. 1000 child of the witch day is usually weak and dies quickly. But this child was different from others, and a real demon was born to people. And even the curse of the witch's moon did not matter to him. Then he brought with him a fateful, powerful, and dangerous force. There was no one in the world who could threaten his life. He understood perfectly well that he had no strength left for a second return to the past. If everything went well, he would have no memory of this, even if the spell was his. Ansi knew full well that all the memories would remain with the young lady, as would the choice of which path to take when she returned. He looked closely at his wife and asked with a smile if the tea party she was talking about was really happening today. The young lady smiled and said that was right. Goyo said that she wanted to try since it was free. She smiled and said that the event was being organized by Viscountess Ellie Vermis. Goyo said that the Vermis family is small, and they are neither aristocratic nor commoners. She sighed heavily and said that many invitations had come, but she didn't know where to go. He looked at her intently, but said nothing. A moment later, the Marquis said that she was right. The Marquis smiled and said that small gatherings were neither burdensome nor boring. Ansi looked at her intently and asked in surprise if she always dressed like that. The young lady was taken aback. She didn't know what to answer, but a moment later she said that it was exactly like that. She looked at him in surprise and asked if she looked strange. He laughed and said that she didn't. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that a little chic wouldn't hurt her after all. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked what he was talking about. A moment later, he used his magic on his wife. A few minutes later, her dress was transformed into a very beautiful and elegant outfit. The young lady froze in shock as she did not expect such a thing from her husband. He slowly approached his wife and said with a smile that now it was only necessary to add the final touch. He applied his magic to her, and a beautiful brooch appeared on her dress. Ansi said with a smile that she was still beautiful, but now stunningly so. He smiled a soft smile and said that her new outfit suited her very well. She looked at her husband in surprise and said that he was very talented, and also asked if he really liked this style. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that this style was still better than the previous one. The Marquis slowly extended his hand to his wife and Goyo. A moment froze and was taken aback. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had business at the palace today and would take her to the Viscount since they were on the way. He smiled and said that they could show people how close they were, and this would be their first public appearance together. The young lady sighed heavily and agreed with him. She said that it was still one of her duties as a marchioness. The Marquis, in turn, looked intently at his wife, but did not answer. He did not expect this from her at all. He looked at her intently and said it wasn't just because of that. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked what he had said that she had not heard. He smiled and said that he didn't say anything and also said that it was time for them to go, but in turn he was a little upset. Some time later, the young lady arrived at the Viscount's mansion. At the entrance, she was met by Ellie Vermis and Rante Fritil. Rante looked at the lady with a smirk and said that Lady Rubiette could go inside. But a moment later, she asked with a smirk, should they really call her Lady Beetlejuice now? Goyo looked at the young ladies with disdain, but said nothing. A moment later, she said that she had no idea that she would meet Ranti here. Lady said that she was here on business, and she also didn't think that she would meet Goyo. She also said that the Marquise looked gorgeous. The young lady looked at the Marquise intently and said with a grin on her face that before her marriage, she dressed like a widow. She asked with a grin where such changes came from. She mockingly asked the Marquise if a rich man had really cheated on her. Like that? Goyo looked at the young ladies intently, but said nothing. Rante looked at the Marquise with a disdainful smile and said that it was just a joke. She knew that her family had never had to complain about finances. The Marchioness, in turn, looked intently at the young ladies. She understood that if she had known that the young ladies would be here, she would not have come. Goyo Zinala that Rante is a well-known member of the conservative faction, and she was also declared the heir to the Marquise. Goyo looked intently at the young lady. She did not understand why she was aiming at her. Goyo knew very well that she was from a ducal family, and wondered if the young lady despised her because of her lack of talent. A moment later, the young lady looked at the Marquise and asked permission to accompany her. The Marquise agreed with a smile. Emily Rayner, the rest, looked at the Marchioness and said with a smile that she was very glad to see the young lady in good health, as there had been some ridiculous rumors going around, and she had been very worried. The young lady looked at Amelia in bewilderment and asked what rumors she was talking about. Bella looked at the Marquise intently and asked if she didn't know. They said that the Marquise had never had relations with girls. Emily said with a smirk that there were many here who had been rejected by him. The young lady looked at the Marquise intently and with a smirk said that everyone said that he was very close to his assistant Caleb. She said that she had heard before that they always lived together and stayed close. The young ladies were shocked. They said that it was simply shameful. The Marquise, in turn, looked intently at the young ladies and asked with fury if they really wanted to say that her husband preferred men. The young lady looked at the Marquise with a smirk and said that they were only discussing rumors. She said that he would hardly have married if it were true. They said that the young lady herself chose the Marquise from the goat. In this case, Tero, although he could have taken a lover. A moment later, the young ladies laughed. The Marquise, in turn, drooped. It was unpleasant for her to hear such things. The young lady looked at the Marchioness and said with a grin that she had exaggerated a little. She asked the Marchioness if she would tell her husband about this. The young ladies looked at the Marquise and said that they were just joking. Goyo, looking at the lady, said that of course she would tell everything. The young lady looked at the Marquise in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Marquise, in turn, said that they were making fun of the Marquis now, and it seemed more like they were invading his privacy now. She said that perhaps it made sense to go to court. Rante jumped up with lightning speed and glared at the Marquise. Goyo looked intently at the young lady. She knew that she usually kept her temper in check. But now the young lady had crossed the line. Goyo wondered if it was all because he was of humble origin. The young lady looked at the Marquise and said that she was only telling rumors. She was asking what the Marquis was expecting if he had never even kissed the girl. The Marquise looked at the young lady intently. She was furious. A moment later, the Marquise sighed heavily and said that it was necessary to know Meru. She said that she was leaving immediately, since she had nothing more to discuss with them. The young lady looked at the Marquise with disdain and asked if she really thought that her family would be afraid of an aristocrat from the common people. The Marquise looked at the young lady with fury and calmly asked if her father was as brave. The young lady was surprised. Her friend asked the Marquise to wait. She asked if they would not become enemies if she brought his case. The Marquise, in turn, looked intently at the young ladies, who were not themselves. The young lady looked at the Marquise intently and said with a grin that she seemed to have forgotten something. The lady with the speed of lightning picked up the cup of tea and poured it on the Marquise, and also told her to take the tea with her. Goyo was in shock as she did not expect this. She closed her eyes, but when she opened them, She noticed that there was no spilled tea on her. She froze in shock as she did not understand what had happened. The young ladies were alarmed because they did not expect to see something like this. They called their friend because they were worried about her. The Marquise, in turn, froze in place in surprise as she saw her spirit. She was very glad that he helped her because she did not expect anything like this at all. A moment later, she looked sharply at the young lady who was glaring at her. The young lady looked at the Marquise with anger and said that the Marquise was very protective of his bride, that he even gave her an artifact. Goyo froze in place and wondered if the lady was talking about Vodun now. She looked at the lady with fury and contempt and said that apparently the tea was not meant for her. Goyo Z wondered if the young lady mistook the spirit for the effect of the artifact. She thought that spirits were a very rare phenomenon. The young lady looked at the Marquise with fury and said that she would not leave it like that. The Marchioness looked at the lady intently and said that she too would remember how the young lady had treated her. A moment later, the young lady told her friends that they were leaving. Emilia looked at her friend intently and asked her to stop. The Marquise, in turn, looked at them intently but did not answer. The young lady looked at the Marquise intently and asked her to take care of herself. The Marquise thanked the lady. The lady looked at the knights and told them to escort the Marquise home. As she was leaving, the Marquise turned around because she heard someone calling her. A moment later, she saw the knight sighing heavily. He looked intently at the young lady and apologized for disturbing her. The knight said with a smile that his name was Rajan Elliot. The young lady looked at the knight in bewilderment as she did not understand what was happening. The young man looked at the Marquise and asked what was wrong with the guy. She smiled looking at the young man and said that this girl. She said with a smile that she was very glad to meet you. The young man froze because he did not know that the knight was a girl. The Marquise, in turn, understood perfectly well that she looked more like a guy. She looked at Regine in surprise and asked what she wanted. Regine looked at the Marquise with surprise and confusion and asked if she had just used magic. She said that she had been very interested in magic since childhood. The Marquise was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing. Regine looked at the Marquise intently and asked if they could talk for a bit. Goyo looked at the knight in surprise, as she had not expected this at all. Sometime later, they returned to the Marquis' estate. The young lady in turn showed her magic. Regine Z froze in place with happiness, as she could witness magic with her own eyes. The Marquise looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was a water spirit and his name was Vodin. Regine was amazed. She said that she was the first to see a water spirit, and it was very beautiful. The Marquise said with a smile that now his maximum is to put out the candles. She looked at the Marquise and asked, what about the fact that he protected her from tea? The Marquise laughed and said it was true. A moment later, they were staring at spirit that was hovering in the air. She sighed heavily and said that she did not know how to make it stronger. Regine S. said that she heard that they were capable of even high-level magic. Marquise looked at the knight intently and said that she heard that they don't grow without a reason. Regina looked at the Marquise intently and asked how about Togo participating in the hunting competition. Looking at the Marquise, she said that in February, the Roman forest would be opened by the royal family. The Marquise looked at her in surprise and said that she was not a knight and had never done such things. She smiled and said that anyone could participate and that it was not necessary to be a knight. She said that it would be great to just look around the area as there were many beautiful places there that crowds of people came to admire. The Marquise thought for a moment and said that she would think about the proposal. Regine looked at the Marquise intently and said with a smile that if she did participate in the competition, she would come every day and support her. Goyo looked at her in surprise as she knew that this was her personal time. Regine said with a smile that everything was fine, and she was a free knight, so she had no restrictions. Regine Wu smiled and said that she had an official status, but stupid rumors started spreading, so she had to refuse. The Marquise looked at her in surprise. She smiled and said that because of her appearance, she is popular with girls, and they mistake her for a man. And when the truth is revealed, they disappear. But unfortunately, they are a little crazy. The Marquise looked at the young lady and laughed in a way she did not expect. A moment later, the Marquis returned to the estate and was greeted by his servants. He looked closely at his subordinates and asked if his wife had returned. The servant looked intently at the Marquis and said with a smile that his wife had returned, and ahead of time with a guest, and they were now in the living room. The Marquis looked at the servant in surprise and asked which guest he was talking about. They said that his wife had returned with a handsome knight. The servant said that he had not seen a uniform look so good on someone for a long time. The Marquis froze with bewilderment on his face. He was puzzled and did not understand what was happening. But a moment later, he still hurried to his wife. He approached his wife and said that it was not good to have affairs right in front of everyone. Goyo was taken aback, as she did not understand what he was talking about. She did not expect to see him so soon. She looked intently at her husband and called him. The young lady in turn timidly called her husband as she saw his evil gaze on the knight. A moment later, she was puzzled told her husband that the knight in front of him was this girl. Rajan looked at them with a timid smile and said that this happens to her all the time. A moment later, she stood up and looked at the Marquis with a smile. She said that this was their first meeting. A moment later, she introduced herself. The Marquis in turn froze in place from shock, as he did not expect such a thing. Looking closely at the knight, he remembered the count he had recently killed. The Marquis looked at his wife intently and asked if she meant the hunting congress. She said that it was all true, but for now it was too much for her. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he didn't think so. He smiled and said that the views of the Ramon forest were impressive. He said that she would not regret going there. She thought for a moment and said she thought he would be against it. She looked closely at her husband and said that there were less than 2 months left until the O Congress. He looked at her intently and said he preferred rabbits or squirrels. He smiled and said that in return, he would prepare a scarf for her. The young lady froze in place. She said that she was not at all sure that she would be able to catch anything, but she would still like to try. He said with a smile that she would certainly succeed. She looked at her husband closely and said that, unfortunately, at the meeting, she heard a story about him. A nasty rumor, and perhaps it is worth taking action on this matter. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. She said that she heard out loud about his sexual orientation. He looked at her in surprise as he was at a loss. The Marquis asked what she was talking about. The young lady stood frozen in place, looking at her husband. She didn't know how to talk to him about it, but a moment later, she finally told him everything. Goyo looked at her husband with puzzlement and asked if he was angry. She could see that he was seething with anger. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that he was just a little shocked by this information. He looked at her intently and asked what she had answered them. The young lady in turn only sighed heavily. She looked at her husband closely and said that she then replied that he did not look gay. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she said that he did not look gay. She looked at him closely and said that she did not. She claimed something that she was not sure of. Anssi sighed heavily. He was shocked by his wife's answer. As he approached his wife, he said that he had not expected her to believe such a thing. He came closer to her and asked with a grin if he really needed to prove this to her. The young lady froze in shock as he was too close. A moment later, he kissed her passionately. The young lady froze in shock on the spot. After the passionate kiss, the young lady became embarrassed. She was perplexed and did not understand why he did it. He looked at her with a grin and asked if she understood now. The young lady sheepishly said that she already knew he wasn't gay. She looked at him intently and said that it was not at all necessary to do such a thing, as simple words would have sufficed. She looked at him intently and said that he shouldn't force himself to do something like that to prove to her. He looked at her in surprise and asked if he didn't have to force himself. The young lady froze, looking at her husband. She wondered who he took her for. She was puzzled since there was no trust coming from him. He came closer to her and said that he was not forcing himself at all, and even the thought of kissing his assistant made him sick. Caleb froze in place in shock because he heard something he shouldn't have. A moment later, Caleb was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. The young lady looked at the Viscount in bewilderment, while the Marquis looked at his assistant with fury. The young lady looked intently at her husband's assistant and said that it would turn out that he had misunderstood everything. The Marquis in turn sighed heavily and said that his assistant constantly wanted to irritate him. The young lady looked sideways at her husband and said with a smile that they seemed to be on very good terms. The Marquis looked at his wife in bewilderment and asked if she was really going to joke now. Caleb shouted at the Marquis that he knew nothing about this matter and that it was unfair to him. The Marquis looked at the young man closely and told him not to let him see him until he calmed down. Caleb looked at the Marquis with tears in his eyes and asked if he could think about him too. The Marquis looked at his assistant intently and told him to keep his mouth shut if that was what he really wanted. The young man in turn thought that the Marquis was simply a villain. The Marquis looked closely at his assistant and said that he had already told him to act according to plan. He told his assistant that they could not be allowed to tell his wife such things about their relationship. The young man looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked what kind of relationship they had. The Marquis looked at his assistant with fury and told him not to repeat anything like that, since he wanted to shoot himself just for mentioning their relationship. The assistant asked the gentleman for forgiveness. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that they would definitely deal with this. Even if it could damage the reputation, he knew that it was simply impossible to let this go. The Marquis looked closely at the documents. He found out all the information about the young lady. The Marquis looked intently at his assistant and said that they had already forgotten all about it, and now he must stand up and say why he had come. The assistant looked at the gentleman intently and said that he had brought him a report about Maziel. Caleb said that a woman with ash-blonde hair, similar to her, was seen in the port of Porsendo. He said that she was followed in several villages, but unfortunately missed in Lodwan. He looked at the gentleman intently and said that it seemed that the lady had returned to Solaris. The Marquis looked at his assistant and asked if she had really returned to that country. The Marquis was a little puzzled. He wondered if she really wanted to lie down for one thing or change her identity. He thought for a moment, and sighing heavily, said that it didn't seem to be that he knew perfectly well that she wasn't that smart. A moment later, he looked closely at his assistant and called him the Marquis, told his assistant to send all the scouts to Solaris as she needed to be found. He looked at Caleb intently and said that the identity of the informant must not be revealed to anyone. The young man looked at his master intently and said that he understood everything. The Marquis sighed heavily and, looking at his assistant, asked if they had dealt with the Count. Caleb said they disguised it as a suicide, and it would be impossible to identify him, after which there shouldn't be any problems. The Marquis was a little worried and puzzled. He wondered if this would be a problem. He looked closely at his assistant and asked if he knew who had come to see them today. Caleb looked at the gentleman and said that he knew that Ragan had come to see them. Elliot Caleb said the Earl had cut off all ties with his children. The Marquis sighed heavily and asked his assistant what he thought of the young lady. Caleb said that she happened to attend the same event as the lady. He said that it was all childish admiration for magic, so she decided to get closer. Ansi looked at his subordinate closely and asked if it was a coincidence. He said that he had heard that she had visited the Vermises before. The Marquis looked at his subordinate closely and told him to provide him with the results within 2 days. The young man was a little puzzled as he realized that he would have to watch someone all night again. Ansi looked at the assistant intently and asked if it was true that she was a woman and not a man. Caleb told his master that it was true, but he did not understand why he was asking that. A moment later, Caleb looked at the gentleman with a predatory smile as he understood what was going on here. Caleb looked at the Marquis intently and said that he knew perfectly well that the gentleman was a perfectionist, but sometimes he went too far. The Marquis looked at his subordinate in bewilderment. Caleb smiled and told the Marquis not to pretend, as this jealousy was coming from his side. He said with a smile that he was afraid that rumors would spread if someone noticed this. The Marquis looked at his subordinate in surprise and asked what he meant by this. The young man looked intently at the gentleman and said with a smile that the gentleman loved his wife. The Marquis looked at his subordinate in surprise and asked if he had gone crazy. He told him not to make anything up, since this definitely didn't happen. The Marquis said that he felt the same way about his wife as he did about Lucullus. Everything would end when the time came. He told his subordinate not to talk about such nonsense. The young man said with a smile that he had no idea that their Marquis wanted to kiss Lucullus. A moment later, the Viscount was taken aback as he realized that his master was very angry. The Marquis in turn looked at his subordinate with rage for such words, and he asked for forgiveness. The young lady looked at the miss intently and called her. She thanked her with a smile for coming. Regin looked at the marquise intently and thanked her with a smile for the invitation. The marquise smiled and called her new acquaintance into the living room. The marquise smiled and said that she had decided to take part in the hunt, but was a little worried because she didn't know what she should do. She looked at her acquaintance with a smile and said that, for that reason, she would be very happy to receive the necessary advice. Regina Wu smiled and said that she really enjoyed communicating with the marquise. She smiled and said that she had already guessed that it would come in handy, and that was why she had brought it. The marquise looked at her friend in surprise and asked what she had brought. A moment later, 2 books appeared on the table. The marquise, in turn, looked at the books in surprise, as they were of a decent size. She looked at the marquise intently and asked with a smile if they could start with the basics. Regin looked at the marquise intently and said that she took the 2 most famous books on spiritual magic. The marquise looked at the lady with a happy smile and thanked her. But she, in turn, was surprised that the books were so thick. Regin told the marquise with a smile that she was very interested in magic, so no one would suspect anything. She looked at the marquise intently and said with a smile that she was saying this so that she would not worry about rumors. Goyo looked at her new friend with a puzzled look and said that she understood her. She was confused because she understood that the books were probably very difficult and she hated studying. A man sitting in the garden heard someone approaching him. The young man looked at his father and asked if he had called him. The man, in turn, continued to go about his business. A moment later, he told his son that he had heard that he had postponed the engagement. The young man said that this was exactly the case because he had a lot of training. The man looked at his son with anger and told him not to make excuses now. The man asked who drinks alcohol every day during training. Tero Z froze in place and did not answer his father's question. He looked at his son and asked what he was unhappy with, since he did not even have competitors. The man did not understand why his son decided to change his mind. He looked closely at his son and asked if he was still worried about another lady's refusal. Tero sighed heavily and said that it was not about that. The man told his son that he had sworn. He looked at his son and said that he had no intention of waiting long, since he had no business with the family after his mother's death. He looked at his son and said that he wanted to get rid of the position of head as soon as possible. He looked at his son and said that if he did not have the necessary qualities, he would not get the position. The man said that he would never hand over the title to a useless person who couldn't even handle his own family's affairs. He looked at the young man intently and asked if he understood him. Tero sighed heavily, and looking at his father, he said that he understood everything. The Duke told his son that he was giving him until April's. He told his son that he must marry Melissa, and no more delays. He told his son to remember this. Tero looked angrily at his father and said that it was his business. The Duke looked angrily at his son and said that it was not so, since it was the business of their entire family. He said that if he failed, the title would go to his brother. The young man was furious. He angrily punched the wall. The butler looked closely at the young gentleman and asked if he was all right. Tero sighed heavily and said that he was fine. Only his head hurt a little, and lately he had been tormented by nightmares. The Marquis looked at his subordinate and introduced his wife to him. Exer looked intently at the lady and with a smile said that he was glad to meet her, and he also introduced himself to her. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said with a smile that she was glad to meet him, and also said that he could call her by her first name. She looked at her husband and said that she had previously thought that only the Viscount was helping him. The Marquis said that he was a young man, a little shy with strangers, and so he decided to introduce them to each other a little later. Ansi smiled and said that today he would teach her the basics of spiritual magic, and he would also teach her hunting tricks. Ansi looked at his wife intently and said that from now on, Regine can waste my time on such things. The young lady looked at her husband closely and said that this was his estate, so she would adhere to his instructions. She also asked his forgiveness for inviting a guest without the owner's permission. The Marquise was taken aback and said that it was not that she looked at him in bewilderment, but he did not answer. A moment later, the young lady called upon her magic and called her friend. The young man, in turn, watched the young lady closely. He looked closely at the spirit that the lady summoned and said that he was still small and was in the stage of infancy. He looked closely at the young lady and said that usually these perfumes develop quickly. X or S told the Marquise that her spirit body was too small and that she would have to use tricks when hunting rather than strike head-on. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her closely and said that she could, for example, cover the victim's head with water and suffocate him or block his vision. He said that there were quite a few effective methods. The young lady looked at the young man and said that it was very cruel. He sighed heavily and said that hunting is hunting and there is no other way. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. He looked at her in surprise and asked if something was wrong. The young lady was taken aback and timidly said that unfortunately she had never hunted. She looked at the young man intently and said that she needed to practice. He came closer to her and said that everything was correct and that she needed practice in this matter. A moment later, she used her magic as he directed. The young man looked at her intently and said that she needed to direct the energy to her fingertips and concentrate. The young lady, breathing heavily, said that she understood him. She was excited and did not know if she could do it. The young man, in turn, looked intently at the lady. He froze because he saw Miss Chloe in her. He did not understand why she decided to take care of the young lady. A moment later, the Marquise was taken aback and cried out. He looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he looked at the lady and said that it seemed that she was a little distracted, but now she needed to rest a little and continue later. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood. She looked closely at her friend, knowing that they had a lot of practice ahead of them. Exer looked at the young lady intently and asked if she knew Miss Chloe Valverde, the Marchioness Frozen Place. She looked at the young man and said that this was her mother's maiden name, and before marriage, her name was Asla Valverde. The Marquise sighed heavily and, looking at the young man, said that after her marriage, she had not had much contact with her family, so she knew almost no one. He looked at her intently and said that he understood everything. Exer thought that Asla Valverde was most likely Miss Chloe's cousin. He wondered if her daughter was a fifth cousin. He thought it was all very strange, since Miss Chloe had never even met her. He didn't understand what her interest was then. The young lady looked at the young man intently and asked why he asked her such a question. He sighed heavily and said that he thought they looked a bit alike, and also asked her for forgiveness. The young man said that they could take a break, and he would immediately ask her to prepare some tea. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he changed the subject so quickly, but she still agreed. The Marquise sighed heavily, as she was very tired. Exer looked at the lady intently and said that summoning a spirit requires a lot of energy. He smiled and said that her efforts had paid off after all, as her spirit had grown greatly. He looked intently at the lady and said with a smile that now it would be better for her to rest, and he would go as he still had things to do. The young lady looked at him intently and thanked him for his help. A moment later, he left, and she was left alone in the room. Goyo sighed heavily as she was very tired. She knew perfectly well that she needed to go to her room, but unfortunately, her eyelids were closing without her consent. The young lady was taken aback as she felt that her body was being moved. The Marquise looked closely at his wife and asked with a smile if he had woken her up. He said that he simply wanted to carry her into the room. The young lady looked at her husband with embarrassment as she did not expect to see him in the box. And moreover, she did not assume that he would carry her into the room. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she had slept well. Goyo was taken aback and said that it was too late and he could have just woken her up. He looked at her intently and with a smile asked her if she remembered what he had said a couple of days ago about fulfilling his wishes. He asked with a smirk. How about today? The young lady in turn looked at him with confusion. Goyo said that she needed to repay him for helping her with her training. She asked what he would like. He smiled, looking at his wife, and said that she could simply choose one of the options offered. She looked at him with bewilderment, but still she felt very pleased. The young lady looked closely at the exquisite outfits. The Marquis, in turn, looked at his wife with a smile. He said that she could choose. Goyo frowned for a moment as she faced a difficult choice. The Marquis looked closely at his wife and said that red looked chic. He asked his wife if she agreed with his opinion. She thought for a moment and said that it was, pointing to another, She said that it was too simple. A moment later, she was taken aback, as she did not expect to say something like that. She was very embarrassed. The Marquis, in turn, looked closely at his wife with a smile on his face. He smiled and said that she used to really like that, but it seemed like her opinion had changed. He smiled and said that he was very glad that she had become accustomed to beautiful things. She looked at her husband with a smile on her face and said shyly that she would wear a red dress. A moment later, the maid looked at Madame with a smile and told her to look in the mirror. The young lady looked closely at her reflection. She saw that the dress looked good. A moment later, her husband came up to her and called her with a smile on his face. He looked closely at his wife and smiling said that the outfit suited her very well. The Marquise, in turn, thanked him with a smile for the compliment. He smiled and asked if they could go now. The young lady looked at the exquisite table in surprise and asked if she really had to choose again. A moment later, she smiled and chose the dish she wanted to try. A moment later, the Marquis snapped his fingers and cast magic. The young lady looked at the table in surprise. The Marquis smiled and said that there was no need to choose here. She asked with a smile where the table had disappeared to. She wondered if he had sent that report to the mountains again. The Marquis smiled and said that it was the servants' dining table. He looked closely at Lucullus and told him to confirm his words. The young man smiled and said that it was so. The young lady said with a smile that they had definitely agreed. A moment later, the Marquis was watching his wife closely as she ate the exquisite dishes with gusto. He looked at his wife with a smile and asked if she liked it. She smiled and said that today it tasted better than usual, and everything looked very elegant. The Marquis smiled and said that it was very good. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that the third time the conditions were the same, Ansi S. asked his wife that she would choose the hall, the estate, or the citadel. She thought for a moment, but looking at her husband, she said that this was some kind of meaningless question. She asked her husband what he was going to do. The Marquis, in turn, did not answer the question asked. The young lady frowned and considered her choice carefully. A moment later, she said she would choose the hall. He said with a smile that he understood everything and would do as she wished. A moment later, he used his magic, and they found themselves in the hall. The young lady, in turn, was very surprised, since they had just been in the dining room. The Marquis looked at his wife with a smile and asked if he could invite her to dance. The young lady, in turn, looked at her husband in surprise. She was amazed and did not expect such a thing from him. But the young lady looked away and timidly said that unfortunately she danced poorly. He looked at her in surprise. He said with a smile that she didn't need to dance well and she should just enjoy herself. He said that she could just follow his movements. Ansi still asked her to dance with him. He looked at her intently and said that if she did not want to, then he would not force her. The young lady, in turn, took his hand with a smile and said that everything was fine, but she asked him not to dance too fast. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was an honor for him, and they could just enjoy this dance. The young lady was taken aback for a moment as she noticed that the music had slowed down. She knew that it was all thanks to his magic, and she was very pleased. A moment later, they began to dance, the young people, looking at each other with fire in their eyes. Goyo looked at her husband with a smile and said that it was the first time she had danced such a slow waltz. The Marquis smiled and said that this melody was especially for her. He asked if she liked it. She smiled and said that, of course, she liked it, and also asked if they could try another dance. He smiled and said that he wanted to dance to this particular tune. Since now everything is exactly as it was when they first met, the young lady froze in place from embarrassment. She thought for a moment, since after her revival, she had called off the engagement. She didn't know why. Maybe because she wanted to see the one who would kill her in the future. For this reason she attended the ball in the capital. They met for the first time at that wonderful ball. The Marquis looked intently at the young lady and asked with a smile if she would dance with him. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect him to ask her to dance. A moment later, she finally agreed, and he whirled her around in a dance. The Marquis looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that unfortunately they were not acquainted. He said that his name was Ansi. The young lady lowered her gaze to the floor and timidly introduced herself. She looked at him intently and said that, as a reward for his services to His Majesty, he had asked for a dance. She sighed heavily and said that she had not expected him to choose her at all. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she still did not seem surprised. A moment later, the young lady said that it was not so at all, and that the offer given to her was unexpected, for her Goyo asked the Marquis if he really wanted to talk to her about something. He looked at her intently and said that he had heard that she had broken off her engagement with Sir Theriot. The young lady in turn timidly said that she liked him. The Marquis looked at her in surprise and asked, "Is it really all in the past?" She looked at him intently and asked if he was always so sharp with words. The Marquis was surprised by such a question. He looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she didn't like it. A moment later, the Marquis froze in place, as he did not expect the young lady to let go and push his hand away. She looked at him intently and asked if he had asked her to dance to make fun of her. She looked at him intently and said that she knew a lot and more than he thought. The Marquis looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she said that the music had already ended. The lady bowed to her dance partner, and the Marquis, in turn, also bowed to her, with a look of bewilderment on his face. She looked away from the young man and said that she had to go. The Marquis was a little puzzled and agitated. He stared at the hand that the young lady easily threw away. Goyo V went out onto the terrace and sighed heavily. She was puzzled and did not understand what the Marquis was thinking. A moment later, her ex-fiancé entered the terrace and asked the young lady if she was okay. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise. She did not expect to see him on the terrace. He looked at her intently and asked what the Marquis had talked to her about. She sighed heavily and said that they were talking about trifles and asked him where her sister was. Tero looked closely at the young lady and said that Melissa was accompanied by Duke Roubier, and today he was Goyo's partner. The young lady looked at the young man intently, but said nothing. A moment later, she turned away from the young man and said that he had better take care of his bride. He froze in shock as he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, he looked at the young lady with a sharp, angry look and asked why she was behaving like that. He was excited. Looking at the young lady, he said that she suddenly drew a line between them. He said that the break in the engagement did not cancel their friendship. The young lady in turn was furious. She did not want to hear such speeches from him at all. Goyo looked at him and said that now everything was different. She said that their relationship would not be the same as when she loved him. The young man was shocked. He did not expect to hear something like this, with the speed of lightning. He grabbed her hand, but she pushed him away. Goyo pushed him away angrily and told him not to touch it, and that he should leave before she called someone. Tero looked at the young lady with surprise and anger, as he did not expect such behavior from her. He called her for a moment, after which they were taken aback as they saw the Marquis. The Marquis looked at the young people with a smile and asked if he had really disturbed them. The young lady looked at the Marquis intently and said that it was not so, and they had already finished their dialogue. The young man in turn was in shock and also in rage. He wanted to talk to his former fiancée. He saw that she was already about to leave and called her, but the Marquis got ahead of him. The Marquis looked at the young man with a smirk and said that the young lady had said that the conversation was over and that he had better leave. Tero was furious, but to his regret, he could do nothing. With the speed of lightning, he left the terrace. The young lady sighed heavily as she had to go through a lot. The Marquis, in turn, looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if he had come on time. The young lady sighed heavily and looked away into the distance. She said that, unfortunately, that was the case. She looked at him intently and said that if he had come to tell her something, then he could speak. The Marquis looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he simply wanted to finish their previous conversation. Looking at the young lady, he said that she looked tired, and therefore they could meet later. Having apologized to the young lady for disturbing her, he turned around and was already heading towards the exit. A moment later, the young lady stopped the Marquis Ancizi, froze in place, as he did not expect her to call him. She looked intently at the Marquis and asked in all seriousness if he would propose to her. He looked at the young lady intently and said that she might have already guessed that he wanted to climb very high, and the wedding was just a way to achieve this goal. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she would not be appearing at the festivities any time soon. Goyo looked intently at the Marquis and said that if he intended to do something, It would be better to do it now. He looked closely at the young lady and slowly approached her. He came very close to her, and with a smirk on his face asked if she would agree to marry him. The young lady pulled him towards her with lightning speed and kissed him. The Marquise was shocked as he did not expect such a thing from her. A moment later, he pulled away from her and froze in embarrassment. Looking at the young lady, Goyo looked intently at the Marquise and said that she agreed to marry him. The young lady looked at her husband with a smile and asked why he had asked her to dance after all. Ansi looked at her intently and said that they had met eyes when the ball began. The young lady looked at her husband in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. But a moment later, she remembered how their eyes had met, and she wasn't sure if he had been looking at her either. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that there was emptiness in her eyes, and her face was expressionless, and she was like a ceramic doll. He said with a smile that he wanted to break this mask. The Marquise looked closely at his wife and said with a smile that he wanted to do this only out of good intentions, and now it does not look like a mistake. The young lady, in turn, embraced her husband with a smile, as she was pleased to hear such a thing. She looked at her husband with an embarrassed smile and said that there were rumors that he wanted to invite His Majesty to dance. The Marquis asked her in surprise what she was saying. He sighed heavily and said that there were many different and strange fables swirling around him. He said that he would certainly sort them out later. The young lady, in turn, only laughed. She looked at him intently and asked what about the last one. He smiled and said that he had already filed a complaint. A moment later, the Marquis pulled the young lady closer to him. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was not so important. The young lady laughed in her turn. She said she thought he was going to kiss her. He asked with a smile if she was really seducing him now. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she had long remembered the look in his eyes when he joked. The young man froze in place from shock. He was surprised that she had been watching him for a long time. The young lady was a little taken aback as she saw that the melody had already ended. She looked at her husband with a smile, as it seemed to her that the melody would never stop. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that the next choice was the rose garden, or the Empress's secret garden. He smiled and asked what she would choose. The young lady froze in surprise, not knowing what to choose. She looked at him intently and asked him what he would do if she chose the Empress's garden. He smiled and said that they could sneak in there, and if anyone saw them, he would erase their memory. With a smile, Goyo said that there was no need for that, and she liked the rose garden, so she chose it. A moment later, the Marquis used his magic, and the young lady froze in place, amazed by the beauty of his magic. The young lady looked intently at the beautiful garden. She looked at her husband with a smile and said that no matter how many times she saw it, she still could not get used to the garden or its magic. The Marquis looked at his wife with a smile and said that she would gradually get used to it. Sometime later, they were happily drinking wine. He looked at her intently and said that it was already midnight. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, not understanding what he was talking about. A moment later, he looked at his wife with a smile and congratulated her on her birthday. The young lady stood frozen in surprise and embarrassment, as she had not expected such a thing. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he was very glad that she was born, and he also congratulated her once again. The young lady accepted his flower and thanked him for everything. For a moment she thought because she was so happy. She knew that she had never had such a wonderful birthday. She looked at him with a smile and said that now it was his turn to choose. Goyo looked at her husband intently and said that he must choose whether he would kiss her or she would kiss him. The young man froze in embarrassment as he had not expected such a thing. He looked at her intently and asked what she was talking about. The young lady looked at her husband with a smile and said that in that case she would choose herself. She slowly approached him and, pulling him closer to her, kissed him passionately. The Marquis was shocked as he did not expect such a thing. After a passionate kiss, the young man looked intently at his wife and said nothing. He was a little surprised as it seemed to him that he was gradually falling in love with her. Marquis Fertil looked at the young lady intently and said that the Marquis had sued several people for slander, and insult. Rante, in turn, was very angry. The Marquis looked at the lady closely and said that some people were already under investigation. He told her that she must understand her situation so as not to get into trouble. The young lady, in turn, did not answer. The Marquise told her that he did not care at all what she had done in the past, but this time she had nevertheless crossed the line of what was permitted. He looked at her intently and said that she needed to apologize to the Marquis. The young lady looked at her father intently and called him. She screamed furiously that these were just petty accusations and that they were able to refute them. The Marquis sighed heavily, and looking at his daughter, he said that they must make everyone think that they could not resist him. He looked at his daughter with a grin and said that this was only for now. He looked at his daughter with a smirk and said that thanks to the Marquise, the dream of becoming a ducal family will come true. He said that it is never too late to kill him. The young lady looked at her father intently and asked if they would get rid of him when he became useless. The Marquis said with a grin that then even the Emperor would not be able to do anything. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood everything, in which case she would write something like an apology letter. The Marquis looked at his daughter intently and in all seriousness told her to stop communicating with Emily Rayner. The young lady froze in place in shock as she didn't expect to hear something like that. He looked closely at his daughter and said that their relationship was nothing but trouble, and if they continued to communicate, their family would have a lot of problems. The young lady looked at her father intently. She was puzzled and did not agree with him at all. She looked at her father intently and said that the young lady was her friend. She furiously told her father not to even think about touching her. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback and screamed as a cup of tea was thrown at her. He looked at his daughter with cold fury and said that she should look for someone better if she still wanted friends. He asked her if she really wanted to ruin her future because of an ill-mannered dog. The young lady looked at her father with fury and screamed. She was shocked and asked him if he was threatening her. She screamed that only she could be the heir to the family. He looked at his daughter with fury and calmly said that he was now the head of the family. He asked his daughter if she understood him. The young lady looked at her father with fury, and trembling with anger, she said that she would do everything as he said. Reiji looked at the young lady with a smile and presented her with a beautiful bouquet of flowers, as well as congratulated her on her birthday. The Marquise looked at her friend with a smile and thanked her, and also asked how she knew it was her birthday. She looked at the Marquise intently and said with a smile that she had asked the butler, and he had told her everything. She said that she also remembered that the Roubier family had once celebrated a birthday in the winter. The Marquise looked at her friend with a smile and said that everything was correct, but in turn she felt a little sad because she knew that it was her sister's birthday, and she had not received any congratulations since she was 10 years old. She looked closely at the Marquise and said with a smile that was not all. The Marquise looked at her friend in surprise. Rajan said with a smile that she also presented a plush dolphin perfume and a birthday cake. The Marquise looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she had prepared many gifts for her, and she was grateful from the bottom of her heart. Rajan looked at the Madame with a smile and said that these were small things. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked if she really shouldn't refuse Rajan's visit. The Marquise thought for a moment and said that it was all true that there were some controversial cases, but if you think about it, it might make her wary, so it would be safer this way. The Marquis said that if the lady had something in mind, it would be better to pretend to be friends and watch her. He looked closely at his wife and told her not to trust the lady. He sighed heavily and said that they still didn't know what was on her mind. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that she understood him and would do her best. The Marchioness looked at the lady intently, wondering what she was really thinking. Rajan looked at the spirit in surprise and admired him. She was amazed that he had grown so much. The lady reached out to the spirit with a smile on her face and said that he looked just like her dog. The Marchioness looked at her friend with a smile and asked if she really had a dog. Rajan said that it was so, and the Marquise could come to her at any time and look at it. She smiled and said that in that case, they could practice on an animal creature before hunting. Goyo timidly said that she didn't want to strangle the dog at all. Rajan thought for a moment and said that wasn't what she meant. She said that her dog hated to bathe and the Marquise could help her. Using her abilities, she looked closely at the Marquise and asked with a smile how she liked this idea. The Marquise smiled, looking at her friend, and agreed with her. Some time later, the Marquise visited the young lady. She used her powers and summoned the spirit. Meanwhile, they watched intently as her spirit and the dog played frolicsomely. But a moment later, the water spirit cut the dog short with water, and it whined because it did not like water. The Marquise, in turn, looked at them with a smile. The Marchioness smiled and told her friend that the dog would have certainly attacked her if it had not been for her spirit. The lady said with a smile that her dog had finally taken a bath since they had not been able to persuade her to do so for a long time. Regin looked at the Marquise intently and said with a smile that her spirit had become faster and that participating in the hunt would not be a problem. The Marquise sighed heavily and said that she too would try not to regret anything. The Marquise looked at the offended dog and asked the lady if there were usually no handkerchiefs prepared for the participants. Regin looked at her intently and said that it was, and also asked who she had prepared the handkerchief for. The Marquise said sheepishly that she had prepared the handkerchief for her husband, as he had said that he would also participate. She looked at the Marquise intently and asked with a smile if she could show her a famous clothing store. The Marquise smiled and said that she would like to do the embroidery herself, and also asked if there was someone who could help her. Regin said with a smile that of course there was such a person, and he was standing right in front of her. Regin smiled and said that Elle was actually better at embroidery, and she could never beat her at it. Marquise looked at her friend in surprise and asked who she was talking about. Regin looked at the Marquise intently and said that she was talking about Eliam now. Sokaju. She looked at the Marquise with a smile and said that it was about her brother. She asked the Marquise if her brother was handsome. The Marquise said embarrassed that it was he. The lady looked at the Marquise intently and asked if her brother was more handsome than the Marquise. The Marquise thought for a moment, and after a few minutes said that she did not think so. The young lady, in turn, was engaged in embroidery, and she also practiced magic. She did not notice how the day of the hunting competition had arrived. The young men arrived in the forest. The young lady froze in place as she was struck by its beauty. A moment later, she came closer to her husband and gave him the handkerchief. She said with a smile that he was also participating in the competition, so she decided to prepare. She smiled and handed him a handkerchief she had made herself. The Marquis looked at his wife in surprise, as he had not expected this at all, but he was very happy. The Marquis looked at the handkerchief intently and with surprise, and said that it looked like it had a four-leaf clover on it, which is considered a symbol of good luck. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile who did it. For some time, he wondered who could have made such a handkerchief. The young lady said with a smile that he was wrong. She smiled and said that this bloody work was the work of a newcomer named Goyo Betelgeuse. The Marquis froze in surprise and asked if she had personally sewn the handkerchief for him. The young lady sheepishly said that it was so, and she wanted to show the sincerity of her feelings. Ansi looked at her with a smile, as he was very happy and surprised by such a gift. He said that it was a very cool gift, and it seems that today he is luckier than the luckiest god. She looked at him intently and smiled, and told him not to make fun of her. The Marquis smiled and said that he was speaking sincerely. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily, as he behaved as always. The Marquis looked closely at his wife and called her. He smiled and handed her a box with a gift. The young lady looked at the gift in surprise and thanked him. A moment later, he asked her with a smile if she liked it. She looked at her husband with embarrassment and said that he had said earlier that the gift would not be too luxurious. He looked at her intently and said that it was a rather modest gift. Anyone would confirm his words. She smiled and asked if they could check. He smiled and said that in this place, many people cannot distinguish luxury from modesty, and it is better not to ask anyone, except Ragan. Goyo said with a smile that Regine was his subordinate. Marquise asked her husband if she would answer honestly. Marquis smiled and said that, unfortunately, it was hard to trust another person, and 3 months had already passed since they were together. The young lady looked at her husband closely and said with a smile that he was acting as if they had been together for 30 years. He looked at her with a smile and said that now it was 3 months, and then it would be 30 years? The young lady froze in place, looking at her husband. She knew that this was impossible. She understood perfectly well that their married life had less than a year left to exist. The Marquis looked at his wife in surprise, as she was puzzled by something. He looked at her intently and called out. She thanked him with a smile. Goyo said that unfortunately, she would not be able to use the gift as a handkerchief. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true. A moment later, the Marquis said with a smile that there were other options for its use. The Marquise looked at her husband in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Having asked for forgiveness, the Marquis slowly tied a scarf on his wife's head. He said with a smile that everything was ready. Now the young lady was surprised. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that this look suited her very well. She smiled and said that she had already told him that she could not use it as a handkerchief. A moment later, they heard a man shouting that the hunting competition was beginning and telling all the participants to gather together. The young lady looked intently at the board, where the lists of participants were. She looked intently at it and saw that she was at the beginning. A moment later, she found her husband and said that he was in the experts. The Marquis was furious because he knew that his assistant had submitted his application for an expert, and so he would go and change everything immediately. The young lady looked at her husband intently and said that unfortunately it was too late to change anything. The Marquis was furious, as he did not want to say goodbye to his wife at all. She looked at him intently and said that it was time for her to go, and also wished him good luck. Goyo didn't have time to move away when suddenly someone crashed into her. The lady looked at the Marchioness with a grin and said that she had not bumped into her on purpose, as the Marchioness had only blocked her path. She asked the Marchioness to be a little more careful. Goyo turned around and saw Miss Emily Rayner. Emily looked at the Marquise with disdain and said that it seemed like she really decided to participate in the competition. Emily said she was looking forward to seeing what artifacts she would show this time. The Marchioness turned around and thanked Emily for waiting for this, and also said that she had to go. The Marchioness thought for a moment, as she had not seen another lady, that Emily was inseparable. From the Marchioness knew that she had better get out of here before she irritated her even more. Emily blocked the Marchioness's path and asked where she was going in such a hurry. The Marchioness looked at the young lady intently and said that if she wanted to say something, she should say it quickly, as she had no time at all. Emily looked at the Marchioness with a grin and said that it seemed that she had changed a lot since her marriage, and that she seemed to feel that she was behind her husband's strong back. The Marchioness glared at her and said that she didn't think Emily should be admonishing her about this. Emily glared at the Marchioness a moment later. Raijin joined them. She glared at the lady and told her to calm down. The Marquise looked closely at the young people, as she saw that a serious scandal was brewing. Emily looked at the lady with a smirk and said that the rumors were true about the Marquis family's strength after all. The Marchioness in turn looked at the young lady with fury in her eyes and told her to be careful with her words. She told the lady that she did not think she wanted to step on the same rake again. The Marchioness looked closely at the lady and asked if she had forgotten what happened last time. Emily looked at the Marquise with fury and asked what she was talking about. A moment later, she was taken aback and said that she was very scared by the Marquise's words. She looked sideways at the Marquise and asked with a smirk on her face if she was really threatening her now. Emily looked at her with fury and told her not to worry, since they would not see each other again anyway. The Marchioness looked at the young lady with bewilderment. Raijin glared at the young lady and asked if she knew what she was talking about. The Marquise understood perfectly well that the young lady seemed to have come to quarrel. The lady glanced sideways at the Marchioness as she saw her gaze fixed on her. A moment later, she asked the Marquise what the strange smell was. The Marquise looked at the lady intently and said that she had used the perfume she had given her, as the lady had previously said that it was a lucky perfume. She looked at the Marquise in surprise, as she had not expected to hear such a thing. Raijin timidly said that it was, but she had previously thought that the perfume had a different scent. The Marchioness looked at the lady with bewilderment and asked what had happened. She smiled and said that nothing had happened. A moment later, she said that it was time for them to move out. The young lady saw a small rabbit in the distance and called out to her spirit. A moment later, with the help of the spirit, the rabbit was enveloped in a bubble of water. The Marquise understood that everything was going as it should, and now she just needed to strangle him with water. She looked intently at the rabbit, who was squealing in fear. She froze looking at him. A moment later, she fell to the ground with a crash and tears in her eyes as she was unable to kill the unfortunate rabbit. The young lady looked at her friend and said that it was not his fault. She said that she herself was simply not ready for such a thing, and so she let the rabbit go. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that even if she managed to find a good prey, she still wouldn't be able to kill an innocent animal. Sitting on the ground, she suddenly heard some noise, and raising her head up, saw beautiful doves circling above her. She stood still, looking at the birds, as she realized that the forest was truly beautiful. The young lady looked at her friend and asked if he wanted to go for a walk. She walked slowly through the forest and looked around its surroundings. A moment later, she approached the lake and froze from its beauty. She stared at the beautiful lake for a while. She came closer to the lake and noticed that the water was crystal clear. She was a little surprised as she could clearly see her face reflected. But a moment later, she was distracted as she heard some noise. Turning around, she saw a beautiful deer. The young lady froze in place as she saw him slowly approach the lake. She noticed that the deer was not afraid of people. She froze in surprise as the deer came very close to her. She was surprised because she saw that he was sniffing something all the time. She looked closely at the deer and said that it seemed like he smelled the cookies. Goyo looked at the deer with a smile and asked if he really wanted to eat it. She smiled and asked him to wait a little. The young lady slowly gave him some cookies. She saw that he was very nice and told him not to hurry. The young lady froze in place as she saw him chewing her handkerchief. She screamed in shock and said that it was impossible to eat. The deer suddenly became frightened and started to run. The young lady was in shock. She screamed for him to give her handkerchief back, as she knew that it was a gift from her husband. The deer didn't listen to her, and she used her magic with lightning speed. A moment later, Spirito enveloped the deer in a water bubble, and a few minutes later it collapsed to the ground. The lady froze in shock and picked up the handkerchief, which was completely ruined. She was in shock because she knew she couldn't use it anymore. She was very angry with herself and wondered why she came here. She sat down on the ground sadly and wondered if she should have gone to this competition. She knew that her friend was already very big, and that was enough for her. She sighed heavily because she knew that she would soon die. But for the first time in her life, she had motivation, but in the end, nothing came of it. A moment later, she heard her friend come closer to her. She was surprised as he was reassuring her. She looked at her friend and said that they thought she could do something. She said that he had better come back. A moment later, she was taken aback and turned around as she saw a terrible beast behind her. The young lady was racing in the carriage at full speed. She was very angry. She wondered if everything would work out for her. She remembered their conversation with the Marquee, since she had come to the competition specifically, and provoked the Marquee in front of everyone. She knew that no one had realized that this was her plan. The lady understood perfectly well that the Marchioness was a very bad woman, and she did not understand at all how she could spread all sorts of rumors. She was shocked since her faithful friend did not help her, although she always did everything for her. A moment later, she heard some noise and froze in place. She was in shock and panic as she couldn't breathe. She screamed in a hurry and asked for help. Goyo froze in shock. She was afraid of the beast that was coming towards her. The young lady was shocked because she knew that this was a beginner's course. She couldn't understand where the wolf came from. A moment later, he rushed at her, growling menacingly. The young lady covered her ears with her palms and screamed loudly. She was very afraid. A moment later, she saw someone throw a dagger straight at the wolf's head. A few seconds later, Wolf R fell to the ground with a crash. The young lady was shocked as the dagger was sticking out straight from the wolf's head. Rajin rushed to the Marquise in a hurry and asked if she was okay. She asked the Marquise's forgiveness for coming so late. She said that she should have gone straight to her and not to Miss Amelia. The Marquise looked at her in surprise as she did not understand what was being discussed. For a moment, the Marquise froze in place in shock. Rajin looked at the Marquise intently and said that her smell attracted monsters. She asked the Marquise for forgiveness for not immediately understanding what you were talking about. She said that someone had tried very hard to make sure that she did not notice anything. The Marquise sighed heavily. She now understood why she had run into her then. The Marquise was in shock, and she understood that this was the young lady's original plan. She looked at the Marquise intently and said that she couldn't stay here because all the monsters would come running to her. She said that they needed to go to the starting point. The Marquise was taken aback and said that this couldn't be done because the monsters might come running to a crowded place. She said that she needed to bathe in the lake. She looked closely at the Marquise and asked how about her friend helping her, since he could clean hers. Goyo looked at her friend with a smile and said that she would do just that, as she had forgotten about him a little. She looked closely at her friend and said with a smile that she relied on him. A moment later she froze as she heard her husband ask her to wait. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was too cold outside for her to swim. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise, since she did not expect to see him here at all. Ragin Z froze in shock, looking at the Marquise. She looked at him intently and asked how he ended up here. The Marquise looked at her husband closely and asked in surprise if his course was not far from them. He smiled and said that he had taken only one step. She looked at him in puzzlement and asked if one step was really by magic. He smiled and said that she was very perceptive. The Marquise looked at his wife intently and said that she did not need to worry, since he would be using his cleansing magic on her. The young lady looked at her husband intently and agreed with him. A moment later, he snapped his fingers and used his magic on her. The young lady froze in place as she felt a slight wind. She felt very good, but suddenly she came back to reality when she looked at her husband's ruined gift. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had already finished doing everything. The young lady looked at him in surprise and thanked him, but a moment later her mood worsened. She looked sideways at her husband and asked for forgiveness. The Marquise looked at his wife in bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was talking about. She handed him the gift he had given her recently, and said with bitterness in her voice that, unfortunately, she had not been able to save it, and it was all her fault. He pulled her closer to him with a smile on his face and said that there was nothing to worry about. A moment later, he cast his beautiful magic on the handkerchief, and it was transformed. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect such a thing. Ansi P looked at his wife with a radiant smile on his face and attached a beautiful flower to her hair. He smiled and said that it suited her very well. The young lady, in turn, looked at her husband with embarrassment, as she was pleased by his attention. He looked at his wife with a smile and said that it was time for them to go. She was surprised, as she did not expect him to help her. The Marquise looked sideways at the knight and said that he had forgotten to tell her something. He said that the competition was not over yet, but they had better return. Regine looked at them with a radiant smile and said that she would go with them too. The Marquis looked at her with fury and said that she would not go as she must enjoy the hunt to the fullest. She was shocked, but a moment later, she looked at the Marquise with a smile and said that if you think about it, she had not enjoyed the hunt yet and had not caught anything. She looked at them intently and said that she would look around a little more, and they could go. The Marquise looked at Madame with a smile and thanked her, and also agreed. Renjin stared intently at the young people, but suddenly she heard some noise. She looked around slowly and sighed heavily. A moment later, knights flew towards her. There were too many of them. With lightning speed, the knights surrounded the young lady. The young man looked at her closely and said that it was very good that she was a very considerate person. He said that they might have just cut her throat. He looked at her intently and said with a smirk that his plans were to attack animals, not people. She looked at the young man in surprise as she recognized him. Caleb looked at her intently and greeted her, introducing himself and saying that he was the Marquis's first assistant, who despite all the difficulties remained a faithful servant. She looked intently at the young man, but said nothing. Caleb looked at her closely and asked with a smile if she would mind talking to him calmly. He looked at her closely and asked if it was she who had given the Marquise that perfume. She sighed heavily and said that she had done nothing to harm the Marquise. He sighed heavily with a smile and said that he didn't blame her for it at all. He said that in any case, he had already checked everything, so there was no problem with it. She looked angrily at the young man and said that he had a strange sequence of actions. He looked at her angrily and said that the Marquise was very important to his master, and if something happened to her, he could easily kill Regine. Caleb looked at the lady sharply and said that they could get straight to the point. He looked at her puzzled and asked why she had come to the Marchioness. She looked intently at the young man and said that she had already told him everything. The young lady looked at Reagan intently and said that her name was Marcel and she had come to pick up her things. She said it was about a music box that was a bird with a broken neck in a cage, and it had the name Elijah written on it. Reagan S. looked at the lady and said she didn't know anything and she needed to go back. Marcel glared at her and told her to return the box, as she was the rightful owner. Regan looked at the lady with fury and asked where was the proof that it was hers. She shouted at her that she had not heard anything about her. Marcel looked at her intently and asked if she would believe her if she told her everything. Marcel looked at her intently and said that in 3 months, her older brother was to become the head of the family. She said that the count was missing and would die in 3 months. Regan looked at her in surprise and said that her father might come back sooner. Marcel looked at her intently and said that it was not so, and her father would not come back. She said that the Marquee must have already killed him. Regan Z froze in shock, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. Regan sighed heavily and said that after that, she accidentally met the young miss at a tea party. She said they started the conversation under the pretext of an interest in magic. She looked at the young man intently and said that she had not meant to harm the young lady in any way. He looked at her intently and asked with a grin if she knew anything about the woman in the cloak. She thought for a moment and said that the woman had gray hair, and they didn't find the music box she was talking about. She looked at the young man intently and said that perhaps she had not existed in the first place. She said that she had a different purpose. Caleb sighed heavily and said that he would certainly convey their entire conversation to the Marquise. He thought for a moment, as he knew that Elijah was the name of the Marquise's biological mother. He wondered if Marcel wanted to show that she was now in the capital. He didn't understand what she was thinking, and wondered if she had another goal in mind. The lady looked intently at the young man, and said that she also wanted to know something. He looked at her in surprise, but with a grin said that she could ask him questions. She frowned for a moment, and asked if it was true that the count was dead. Caleb sighed heavily, and said that unfortunately, it was true. She was shocked, as she understood that this meant that the count had been killed. He looked at her intently, and asked with a grin if she was really thinking about revenge now. She looked at the young man intently, and said that she had never thought about it. She looked at him with a smile, and said that she was just sorry that she couldn't kill him. Caleb in turn was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear something like this. He looked at her excitedly and asked what she was talking about now. The young lady sighed heavily and said that the count was a very stern man, and for him, the concept of family did not exist. She said with fury and coldness in her voice that the count was just trash, and she in turn was afraid that he might go back home. She looked closely at the young man, and with a joyful smile on her face, thanked him for killing the count. He looked at her with a smile, and now understood what the Marquis meant when he said that there was no need to worry about her, as she was very similar to the forest. She looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Some time later, the young lady and her husband were slowly riding back on horseback. He looked at her closely and asked with a smile if she was comfortable. The Marquise smiled and told her husband that everything was fine and she was comfortable. She looked at him in surprise and asked with a smile if he didn't need to hunt now. The Marquis looked at his wife with a radiant smile and said that he had already caught what he wanted. She turned her gaze away from him and said with sadness in her voice that it seemed he had already caught his prey. The Marquis was taken aback, not knowing what to answer, but a moment later he said that it was so. He was surprised and did not understand why her face had changed so much. The young lady knew that it was normal, but she wondered why she was so irritated. Then she felt like she had become more emotional after returning to the past. She looked closely at her husband and asked with a smile what he had caught. He smiled and said that it was a secret because he wanted to make a surprise for her. She said with a smile that everything was correct because it was such a tradition to dedicate the catch to the beloved. He looked at her intently and said that she too wanted to catch a deer for him. He asked if that was true. Goyo S. said that it was just an accident as the deer just fell on the grass. Marquise looked at her with a smile and said that an accident is also not bad. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was true. The young lady thought for a moment about what had happened. A moment later, she looked into the distance and saw a beautiful sight. She was struck by the beauty of the forest. For a moment it was thoughtful, as she knew that, only recently, she was thinking about what she had forgotten in this competition. Everything infuriated her, but now she was glad that she was here. She looked closely at her husband and wondered if this was all because of him. The Marquis looked closely at his wife and said with a smile that she was a good girl. She smiled because she was pleased that he praised her. She said with a smile that he was also a good boy. The young lady froze in shock. She heard everyone behind her whispering. They were also shocked and did not understand who could have done this. The Marquise looked closely at her husband and asked in bewilderment if it was really him. The Marquis smiled and said that it was indeed so. He smiled a beaming smile and said that he had caught a sea beast for her. She looked at him with bewilderment and thanked him. Ansi looked at his wife and said with a smile that he was not very handsome. Ansi said that he knew that this was not what she expected, so he prepared something else for her. The young lady looked at her husband in bewilderment, but a moment later she saw a beautiful rabbit in his arms. She was surprised because she did not expect to see something like this. She came closer to him and asked if he really wanted to make a scarf out of it. The Marquise was shocked. He looked at her intently and asked if she really thought that of him. Arms with a smile on her face and said that she was joking. The Marquise sighed heavily and said that it was not funny at all. She said that it was very similar to his jokes. He looked at her in surprise and asked if his jokes were really that unfunny. The young lady just laughed. Sometime later in the mansion, the Marquis read the letter. He was shocked because it said that Roubier forgives him. The Marquis looked at his assistant in surprise and asked what this meant. The young man looked at his master and asked if this could mean that Marcel had ended up in Roubier. He said that it could be that she had incited Emilia. Ansi sighed heavily and said that he noticed that Emilia was acting suspiciously. Caleb said that after that, Emily was found dead in the carriage, and the cause of death was a heart attack. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that this was not so. The attack happened because of black magic, and he felt a faint trace of magic. He was a little puzzled because he knew Emily didn't have magic. He said that it meant that it was someone who had very good abilities. Caleb looked at the gentleman sharply and said that this meant she was targeting Goyo. Ansi looked at the assistant closely and asked what was wrong with Roubier. Caleb sighed heavily and said that everything was unchanged. The Marquis said that everyone knew perfectly well that the Duke didn't care about his eldest daughter. He said that they needed to make sure that the Marquise was perceived only as Betelgeuse. Caleb looked at the gentleman intently and asked if Marcel was in cahoots with the Duke. The Marquis looked hard at his subordinate and said that he did not think so, since the Duke would not act so rashly. The Marquise told Caleb to check who Emily had been in contact with and where she had gone. Caleb bowed and told his master that they were already working on it. He looked at the gentleman intently and told him not to worry, since no one would know about it, and they had already collected enough evidence anyway. The Marquis looked closely at his subordinate and said that he could go now. The Marquis stood frozen in place as darkness began to envelop him. She told him that he needed to protect Valverde's only daughter, but in exchange he would have to get rid of Roubier. He in turn understood perfectly well that in this way the child would be able to gain freedoms. Leaving the Marquis's office, Caleb bumped into a young man. He looked at him intently and asked if he had come to report. Caleb said that if that was the case, then now was not the right time. Exer looked at the young man in surprise and asked what was wrong. Caleb said that the Marquis was not in the mood right now. Exer looked at him intently and said that if this is all because of Marcel, then they will definitely find her. It's only a matter of time. Caleb sighed heavily and said that it was not so, and the Marquise was upset every time when the Roubier family was mentioned. Exer said with rage that it seemed that this was because the opportunity to take revenge on them was approaching. Philip said with bewilderment that everything was not so. He timidly looked away into the distance and said quietly that it was all because of Madame Goyo. He said that the Marquise was originally a strange person, but he changed after the wedding. Caleb thought for a moment and said that the Marquise had become even more terrible. The young man looked at Caleb in surprise and asked if that was a good thing. Caleb frowned and said that perhaps it was. Ansi looked closely at his subordinate and asked if a luxurious gift was too much of a burden for the girl. The young man looked at his master in surprise and asked what he was talking about. A moment later, he asked if the Marquise was talking about a gift, for the Marquise Annecy did not answer the question. Looking out the window, he sighed heavily and said that the young lady was gradually beginning to get used to this life. He stood frozen in place, looking at the beautiful young lady who greeted him. He looked at her intently and told his subordinate with a smile that for this reason he did not want to give something simple. Caleb looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked if he was really talking to him now. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that he could not do anything, and he would have to give her a white rose. Caleb looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked if this was really his gift. The Marquis smiled and said that it was indeed so, and he knew that the young lady would definitely like it. Caleb looked at the gentleman intently and said that the lady would definitely like the gift. The Marquis froze in place. A moment later, he looked at his subordinate with fury. He sighed heavily and said that this was not what he wanted to give her. Ancs said that he would like to give her a more meaningful gift, after which she would not grumble at him. Caleb looked at the gentleman in surprise and, sighing heavily, asked if he really wanted to receive a kiss from the young lady after the gift. Caleb sighed heavily, as he knew this was a good reason. The young man looked at him in confusion. Caleb, in turn, understood perfectly well that the Marquis looked at her differently. He knew that the gentleman was sincere towards the young lady. He knew that on the battlefield, the Marquis was more like a cruel demon. But with the young lady, he was completely different. Caleb could not even imagine in his dreams that his master could be so gentle. Caleb looked at the young man closely and said with a smile that it was a good change after all. A moment later, he turned and walked away. Exer Ono looked after the young man, and he asked after him if the owner had really changed for the better. But unfortunately, he never received an answer to his question. Raindine looked at the Marquise intently and said that she would like to tell her something. The Marquise looked at her intently and said that it seemed she did not want to talk about it in front of the Marquise. She said that she was very surprised by the fact that she had sent a carriage for her. She looked at the Marquise intently and said that she wanted to apologize to her initially, since she actually had some purpose in communicating with her. The Marquise looked at her in surprise. Regine sighed heavily and said that she wanted to know about the Marquise's family, but she had no intention of harming the Marquise. However, she did not justify her motives for her actions in any way. The Marchioness looked calmly at the lady and asked if anyone among the nobles did anything for no reason. She thought she could sort things out with Regine a little. She understood perfectly well that if she had had bad intentions, her husband would have already dealt with her. She looked intently at the Marquise and asked if she would accept her apology. Goyo looked at her with a smile and said that everything was fine and she didn't have to worry about it since she forgave her. The young lady looked at the Marquise in surprise and asked if she was not angry at all. The Marquise smiled and said that nothing terrible had happened to her, so everything was fine. Regine was in shock. She said that in some way it was a betrayal on her part. She asked the Marquise if this didn't bother her. The Marquise looked at the lady in surprise and asked what she was saying. She said that she had never looked at the situation in that way. Regine sighed heavily and said with sadness in her voice that she thought that they were really close. She looked hard at the Marquise and said that it seemed she had not counted on her. Regine thought for a moment, as she had never met anyone like the Marquise. She knew that the Marquise was very calm and peace-loving, and when they were together, she felt calm. She was confused because she thought that the Marquise felt the same way around her, but unfortunately, it turned out that the Marquise did not expect anything at all from their communication. The Marchioness looked at the lady intently and said that if she wanted to say something, she could speak now. She looked at the Marquise intently and asked excitedly if the Marquise would like to become her friend. Goyo froze in surprise as she did not expect such a thing. For a moment, she was lost in her memories. She remembered how Rario, with a radiant smile, looked at her and said that they were friends forever. She knew that he was her only friend with whom they started a relationship and got married, but she understood perfectly well that all those words were empty promises. The young lady felt sad for a moment as she was now indifferent to these words. She looked at the lady closely and said that she was a fairly ordinary person. She looked at her intently and said that if she communicated with her, she would not get any benefit from it. Regine Z froze looking at the Marquise, as she did not expect to hear anything like this from her. The Marchioness smiled softly and said that the young lady should think about her decisions before making friends. The young lady stood still for a moment. She did not know what to answer, but collecting her thoughts, she said that she was not looking for any advantage at all. She looked intently at the Marquise and timidly said that all she wanted was to talk to her over a cup of tea. Rajan said that she asked the Marquise for forgiveness because she wanted to get her consent to be friends. She looked intently at the Marquise and asked if she was against their friendship. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer, as she was very hurt by the past betrayal. Rajan O turned her gaze away from the Marquise and said that if she didn't want to, she could refuse. She looked at the Marquise intently and said that in that case she would return alone and would no longer be friends with anyone. Goyo thought for a moment, because looking at the lady reminded her of her husband, because he had spoken such words to her. The Marquise in turn understood perfectly well that they were not yet sufficiently familiar, and besides, she did not know whether this friendship would be beneficial for her. She understood perfectly well that the Marquis would soon abandon her, since there was less than a year left before he would kill her and get rid of Roubier. She understood perfectly well that this friendship would not harm her in any way. She looked at the lady with a smile and agreed with her, and said that they would still see each other. Regine was shocked as she did not expect the Marquise to agree so quickly. The Marquise said with a smile that she did not want to be alone in the mansion all the time. The lady looked closely at the Marchioness and thanked her, and she also asked if the Marchioness would allow her to be a little impudent. The Marchioness looked at the lady in bewilderment. She looked intently at the Marquise, and with a radiant smile said that the Marquise could call her by name and speak informally to her. She looked at her and timidly asked if the Marquise could do it. Goyo in turn looked intently at the lady and thought. A moment later, she looked at the lady with a beaming smile and said that she could do it and called her by name. Goyo looked at her husband closely and said with a smile that she and Madame Regine were now friends. She smiled and said that she didn't know if it was right to call their relationship friendship. The Marquis smiled and said that if they were so close, then it was friendship. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she had communicated a lot with Madame. The young lady thought for a moment and looking at her husband, asked if he had any friends. He was shocked by such a question, and a moment later said that for some reason this question hurt him. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really had no friends. Goyo was a little surprised, since he communicates well with many people. The Marquise thought for a moment and said that he communicates with many people, but they are not friends. He looked at the young lady intently and said that his wife was more important to him. The young lady, in turn, was very much embarrassed, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. But a moment later, she said that she understood him. He smiled and asked if she wanted to know anything else. The young lady thought for a moment, and with a sly grin, said that she didn't even know what to ask. He looked at her with bewilderment, as her grin embarrassed him. She looked at her husband closely, and said that the owner of the LMS family would soon change. The Marquise looked at his wife closely and said that he had also heard about it. He smiled and said that there were a lot of rumors about this. He looked at her with a sly grin and asked if she really thought such a man was handsome. The young lady said without hesitation that he did. The Marquise was shocked. He froze looking at his wife. He looked at her intently and said that he was not talking about himself, but about his brother, Madame. The young lady looked at her husband intently and said with a smile that he was handsome like her friend. The Marquise froze in shock and said nothing, and the young lady in turn only laughed. Some time later, the Marquis gave his wife sketches of outfits. He said that she could choose what she liked. She looked at him in surprise and said that she already had enough outfits. The Marquis looked closely at his wife and said that there would soon be a ball in honor of the hunting competitions. He said that her outfit should match his clothes. The young lady was taken aback, as she had completely forgotten about this. She looked at her husband closely and asked if she had to go there. He said that if she didn't want to, she didn't have to go. He said that, however, he couldn't not go since he had won first place in the competition, and for that, he needed a partner. The young lady realized that she couldn't get out of it. She looked at her husband closely and said that she did not need a new dress because she did not want to stand out too much. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that everyone says that the more delicious food a person eats, the better his taste buds become. He smiled and said that it seemed that she was not yet accustomed to luxury. Ansi said that from now on, all the food and clothes would be better than she had before. He said that he wanted to see her in something that she would really like. She looked at him intently and said that he had no need to waste money. He smiled and said that it was not a waste of money. This is how they were reviving the economy of their country. The young lady sighed heavily. She said that there was no way she could convince him otherwise. The young lady opened the catalog a couple of days later and froze. As there were so many beautiful options, the Marquis said that he had already paid for each dress model, and he did not want to see these outfits on others. The young lady was shocked and did not expect that he would buy all the outfits. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he spent money on a model of dresses that she would not even wear. He looked at her with a smile and said that these were not just models. A moment later, he used his magic, and exquisite outfits rained down on the young lady. She was shocked because she did not expect this. He looked closely at his wife and said with a smile that it would be better to try everything on himself so that she could decide which outfit suited her best. Goyo sighed heavily. She knew she couldn't convince him otherwise since he had already done everything. She looked at him intently and said that it was his money and he knew best how to use it. He smiled and thanked her for permission. She looked closely at one of the outfits and said that she really liked it. The Marquis looked closely at the outfit and froze in place. He looked at his wife in surprise and asked if it wouldn't be cold in it. He said there were other options. The young lady looked sideways at her husband and asked what was wrong with that, as she would be taking revenge. The Marquis thought for a moment, but still, a few minutes later, he agreed and said that she could try it on. The young lady thanked him with a smile. Some time later, the young lady was resplendent in an exquisite outfit. The Marquis looked closely at his wife and said with a smile that she was beautiful in whatever she wore. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. But a moment later, she thanked him for his wonderful words. She looked closely in the mirror, enjoying the apparatus, but still said that she felt she needed to work on her posture. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. He looked at his wife in bewilderment and asked if his praise did not seem sincere to her. Ansi slowly approached his wife from behind and said with a sly smile that it seemed she was still missing the necklace. The young lady froze in place as she did not expect his approach. She looked timidly at her husband and said that she was not sure that it was needed there. He smiled and said that she did not need to worry about such things, since they would find what she needed. She looked away from him and asked if he hadn't heard how sincere her words were. The Marquis was taken aback and froze in place, as he had not expected to hear such a thing. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really thinking that she looked like a fool. He laughed, looking sincerely at his wife. The Marquis came closer to his wife and said that he had never thought that of her. He looked at his wife with a smile and said that he was just glad that he had such a sweet wife. The young lady pushed her husband away and told him not to act like a real womanizer. He looked at her in surprise and said with a smile that these were very rude words from her, since she was the only woman in his life. The young lady sighed heavily and said that they didn't know what would happen next. The Marquis froze in shock on the spot. A moment later, he grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him with lightning speed. He kissed her passionately. The young lady was shocked because she didn't expect this from him. He kissed her, and she found it hard to breathe. The young lady pulled away and called him. The young lady looked at her husband in shock and said that she almost choked. She froze, as she did not understand his expression. The young lady called her husband, but he did not answer. Goyo was a little puzzled, as his gaze frightened her very much. Ansi timidly turned away from his wife and asked for forgiveness. She looked at him sharply and said that his joke had gone too far. A moment later, his expression changed, and he said with a smile that he would be careful. He smiled and asked if she had really decided to choose this particular outfit. He said that they would definitely make the outfit to her size and return it to her ready-made. He smiled at her softly and said that it was time for him to go. The young lady froze, looking after him. She did not understand what had suddenly come over him. Ansi was in shock and did not understand what was happening to him, because suddenly he was overwhelmed by emotions. He was puzzled, because as he had always controlled his emotions in the presence of his wife, He simply did not want to hear any words of refusal or submission coming from her lips. He was furious because this really wasn't like him. Regina sighed heavily, and looking at the Marquise, said that no one had taken her. She was puzzled because she had done well in the hunting competition. She looked at the Marquise intently and asked if she had a place for her, the young lady from the air, and said to her friend that unfortunately she could not interfere in these matters. She looked at her friend and asked, didn't she herself say that she did not need anything from her? Regan looked at the Marquise with a puzzled expression and said that she could take the entrance exam herself. She just wanted to get a place on the exam. The Marquise smiled and apologized to her friend and said that she couldn't promise anything. She sighed heavily and said that it was very ruthless of the Marquise. The Marquise looked at her and asked why she came today. She said that she would like to warn in advance. She looked at the Marquise intently and said that in honor of the hunting competition, a ball would be held by the imperial family, and there Alt and Roubier would announce their engagement. The Marquise sighed heavily and said that the time had already come for this. The young lady, in turn, was a little puzzled as she thought that she would never meet her sister and ex-husband again. She was puzzled as she did not expect at all that they would be able to meet so soon. She looked closely at her friend with a smile on her face. Regan understood perfectly well that the Marquise was very good at hiding her emotions. Now it seemed to her that the Marquise was hiding something from her. She looked at the Marquise intently and wondered if the day would ever come when she could trust anyone. She looked at the young lady intently, for she knew that she would never be that person to her. The lady looked at the young man and called him. Ancy looked at Chloe with confusion. Chloe looked at him intently and asked if he liked the way she looked. Chloe said, looking at the young man so that he would listen to her more attentively. She said that the more he does not have, the more he wants to seem more luxurious, and since such people do not want to be looked down on. But this child is beautiful. She looked at him closely and said that she thought a red dress would suit her, but strangely enough, she began to wear more and more ordinary everyday clothes. Chloe came closer to him and said that she would tell him again. She looked at him with a radiant smile and said that the bright dress looked prettier. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't care since clothes didn't matter to him. She looked at him intently and told him to listen to her. She said that one can be born completely but be absolutely empty inside. She asked the young man if he didn't think that she should at least dress nicely. He sighed heavily and said that it was not. So Chloe smiled and said that he was right, but still he would soon love luxury too. She looked at him and said that eventually he would find love. She said with a smile that there was nothing more beautiful than love, but still she didn't know if he could ever love. The Marquis in turn looked intently at his sleeping wife. He understood perfectly well that she was very beautiful. Ancy knew that a red dress would definitely suit her. He sighed heavily and said that he still really liked the color red. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked if he really wanted a different dress. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was not so, and everything was fine. She said with a smile that it seemed that with his purchases, he had already improved the country's economy enough. She smiled and said that she thought that was enough. Ancy looked at his wife intently, because he did not think that his wife could refuse him. Goyo looked at her husband with bewilderment, because he worried her a little. She asked her husband excitedly what had happened. He looked at her with a smile and said that the green dress suited her white skin very well. He said that, although he liked the red color, green was also not bad. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, but thanked him nonetheless. He sighed heavily and, looking at his wife, said that unfortunately he still had things to do, so he had to go. The young lady looked at her husband closely and agreed with him. She was a little puzzled by his change of mood. She looked closely after him, because she saw that he was worried about something. The young lady glanced sideways at the Viscount and asked if he knew what had happened to the Marquis. She asked anxiously if the problem was in the dress. The Viscount smiled and said that it was not. The Viscount looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that he thought it was all because she was very beautiful. The young lady looked at the Viscount with embarrassment. A moment later, she said he was lying, puffing out her sweet and beautiful cheeks. She said it seemed the Marquise had told him what was the matter. The Viscount looked at his lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He shouted that the Marquise had told him nothing. The Viscount looked closely at his master, for he saw that he was alarmed by something. Caleb looked at the gentleman sharply and said that he could simply ask the young lady to change into another dress. The Marquise, puzzled, said that the main thing was that the young lady liked it, and the rest was not important. The Viscount sighed heavily as he saw that the Marquise had taken up his own again. He said that he understood the gentleman. He looked at the Marquis intently and said that he seemed to be completely unconcerned about what his wife was wearing. The Marquis looked at his subordinate with fury and said that he could cut his bonuses. Caleb was shocked looking at the master. He asked why he was immediately dumping everything on him. He looked at the gentleman intently and asked if he knew when he behaved most strangely. The Marquis looked at his subordinate in bewilderment, as he did not understand what he was talking about. Caleb looked hard at the Marquis and said he couldn't stand by a young lady and say what he liked and what he didn't. He was puzzled and did not understand why the gentleman was behaving like this in front of her. Caleb looked at the master intently and shouted that he, as a butler, was simply bursting with excitement about this situation. He looked at the Marquis intently and said that, in any case, if the Marquis did not say it, then he would do it himself, since he did not understand why the Marquis simply could not confess his feelings to hers. He looked at the gentleman intently and said that the young lady must definitely know about her husband's true feelings. The Marquis looked at his subordinate with fury and told him not to cross the line. The young man froze in place as he realized that things were getting hot. He understood that the Marquis could punish him. A moment later, the maid came into their office and said that it was time to leave, and she would go and warn the mistress. As he left, the Marquis looked intently and coldly at his subordinate, and said that he was very lucky today. The maid looked at the gentleman in bewilderment, as she did not understand what was being discussed. She was alarmed by the expression on the gentleman's face. The Viscount sighed heavily and said with relief that he had escaped today. He looked at the maid with a smile and said that she had come just in time, and thanked her. The maid looked at the Viscount with bewilderment, as she did not understand what had happened at all. Some time later, the Marquise cheetah arrived at the event. Everyone looked closely at the young people, not taking their gaze off them. The young ladies looked at the Marquise intently. They were amazed at her change. They said that she had become much more beautiful after she got married. They said that her complexion had become much better. The young lady was confused by such rumors. She was puzzled as she had heard everything perfectly well. The Marquis looked closely at his wife with a smile on his face. He decided to support her. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that she needed to control herself and not give in to emotions. The ladies slowly surrounded the Marquise and told her with a smile that her outfit was simply superb. They were delighted and asked who had sewn such a beautiful outfit. The young lady froze in place. She did not know what to answer and was very excited since no one had ever paid so much attention to her at events before. She timidly thanked the young ladies for their compliments. The Marquis watched his wife closely, who was having a good time, but suddenly his gaze fell on his wife's cleavage. Since he was embarrassed that the outfit was very open, a moment later, a man approached him. Since he wanted to talk to him, the Marquis timidly asked the young man for forgiveness, since he was a little distracted. The young man looked intently at the Marquis and agreed with him with a smile. The Viscount looked at the gentleman closely and asked if he was enjoying the celebration. The Marquis was surprised, as he did not expect to see his friend at the event. He looked closely at the young man and asked him what he was wearing. The Viscount smiled and said that it was very cold today, and he decided that the cape would be perfect for the weather. The Marquis looked at his friend in surprise, but said nothings. Meanwhile, the Viscount was looking intently at the gentleman, since he saw that he was not taking his gaze off his wife. The Viscount asked the gentleman if there was something he didn't like. The Marquis looked at his subordinate with fury and told him not to go to hell. He looked at him and asked how much the cape cost. Caleb said that the cape cost 3. The Marquis froze in shock as he understood that 300 gold was just robbery. The Viscount looked at his master intently and said that he should not be petty. He asked the Marquis if he himself had not said that he would prepare the very best for his beloved. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that he would take the cape. The Viscount looked at his master with a smile, as he had made a good profit. The Viscount looked at the gentleman intently and said with a sly smile that he very much hoped that they would enjoy the ball. A moment later, a man approached Mark and Tooth, and looking at him, said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The Marquis was shocked, as he did not expect to see the Duke in person. The Duke looked closely at the young man and asked how he was doing. The young lady went out onto the balcony and sighed heavily. She was very tired, and she simply had no strength. She was a little puzzled, because before at such parties, few people spoke to her, and she felt calm. But now everyone wanted to talk to her, and she felt very difficult. She stood on the terrace for a while, but she noticed that it was already late and chilly. Goyo blushed and said that it was time for her to go inside. Turning around, she froze in place as she saw her ex-husband from a past life. The young man looked intently at the young lady and called her. Goyo looked away from the young man and asked if he shouldn't have left the terrace after he saw that someone was there. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he would like to meet her. She looked at him intently and asked what happened. She addressed him formally. Tero looked at the young lady with fury and told her not to call him like that. He looked at her closely and said that she had very beautiful dresses. He said with a grin that it was a pity that she married a man who would not allow her to wear the clothes she liked. Goyo looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. Tero smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that she had never worn anything like this before her wedding, and that she had always liked simple clothes. And he smiled and said that they suited her very well. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she really liked the dress very much. Goyo looked at him intently and shouted that it was her personal choice. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Without taking his eyes off her, he asked if she had chosen this outfit herself. The young lady said it was, and she liked it very much. He was in shock and screamed that he just couldn't believe it. But a moment later, he took hold of his head as it was hurting him badly. The young lady was frightened for a moment and looked at him intently. She wanted to help him, but still stopped in place. She looked at him intently and said that she thought they had nothing more to talk about. She said that she would go and he could stay. The young lady was about to leave when suddenly the young man grabbed her hand. Goyo looked at him in surprise and called out. He looked at her intently and asked if she was happy that she had married the Marquis. The young lady thought for a moment, but a few minutes later, she said that she was satisfied with everything. She looked at him intently and told him to let her go while she pulled her hand out of his tight grip. He was very surprised and shouted at the young lady to stop, but Goyo was not going to continue the dialogue with him. The young lady left the terrace with lightning speed and sighed heavily as she entered the hall. Goyo was a little puzzled as she realized that even inside the hall, it was cool. A moment later, the Marquis approached his wife and tenderly wrapped her in a shawl. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was chilly today. The young lady looked at her husband with an embarrassed smile, as she was very glad that he had brought her a shawl. A moment later, a young lady approached them, gave them a radiant smile, and asked the Marquis if she could invite him to dance. At the same time, the Marquise looked closely at the young lady, as she did not expect such a thing. The Marquis looked at the lady intently and asked what he should do since he was because of a leg injury, he can't dance with her. The young lady was surprised by this answer, but a moment later said that she understood. With the speed of lightning, she left their company. She was a little puzzled and did not understand what was wrong with him. The Marquis looked intently at his wife and, offering her his hand, asked if she would dance with him. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked with a smile how his sore leg was. He smiled, looking at his wife, and said that it was almost healed. Goyo smiled and told her husband that he was very good at healing magic. He smiled and said that unfortunately he was not so good at it, and for this he used pain-relieving magic. A moment later, they were whirling joyfully and playfully in a beautiful dance. She looked closely at her husband and said with a smile that he danced very well. The Marquis playfully tilted his companion and said with a smile that it was all because she was next to him. The young lady laughed, looking at her husband as she was having fun with him. At the same time, the young man looked intently at the Marquis cheetah. Tero stared at the young lady. He was shocked and did not expect this from her. He understood perfectly well that he was her only friend, who was always by her side. He was puzzled and did not understand why she was now with this man. A moment later, memories suddenly came flooding back to him. The young lady looked at him intently and asked if he would stay with her for a while. He saw a terrible picture of the Marquis taking the coffin away from him. He shouted in rage at the Marquis to return the body. He was in shock and did not understand what was happening at all. Tero was breathing heavily as many memories came flooding back to him. At once he was confused and did not understand what was happening to him lately. The young lady came closer to him and asked if he was okay. Tero looked at her closely and said that he was fine, and called her Ellie, and the young lady froze in shock. Tero was a little puzzled and wondered what he had just said. He asked Melissa for forgiveness and said that he was not feeling well and would be going out for a while. She stared at him with an angry expression and wondered if he was seeing another woman. She looked at him closely and realized that a piece of trash like him could easily do something like that. After a beautiful and cheerful dance, the young lady sat and rested. The Marquis presented his wife with a glass of champagne. The young lady looked closely at her husband and thanked him as she wanted to drink something. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard someone calling her. She looked closely at her sister. Goyo was surprised, as she did not expect sister to approach her. Melissa smiled as she looked at her sister. She said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Melissa looked sideways and angrily at the Marquis and said that she needed to talk to sister. She looked at her sister with a smile and asked if she could spare some time for her. Goyo looked at Melissa with bewilderment, as she did not understand what sister wanted to talk to her about. The young ladies slowly walked out onto the terrace to talk in private. Melissa sighed heavily and told her sister that she was engaged. Goyo looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that it was time, and she also congratulated her sister on her engagement. Melissa looked at her sister with tears in her eyes and said that she didn't really want to get engaged at all. She told her sister that she admired her very much. Melissa sighed heavily and said that if she had a choice, she would have wanted to choose her own groom, but in the end, she did as her mother told her. Melissa looked at her sister worriedly and asked, what if she asked her for help? Melissa glared at her sister, but a moment later, she told her to forget about it all, since there was nothing she could do about it anyway. Goyo looked at her sister with concern, as she felt very sorry for her. She asked Melissa what happened. Melissa, in turn, timidly said that everything was fine, and she was on the right path. She smiled and said that everything was fine. The young lady looked at her sister and called her, but suddenly Melissa's face changed, and she asked her sister for forgiveness. Melissa looked at her sister with a beaming smile and said that it was her mistake, that she told about her sister about everything right after a month of engagement. She smiled and said that it was time for her to go. Goyo looked closely at her sister and told her not to worry. She said that her fiancé definitely loved her. Melissa looked closely at her sister and agreed with a smile on her face. Goyo thought for a moment and wondered if her sister was suffering from premarital depression. She understood perfectly well that the young man sincerely loved Melissa, and she knew it better than anyone. But in turn, the young lady wondered if Melissa loved Tero. The young lady sighed heavily, as she was not sure about this. She looked at the young people closely, as she felt she had been thinking too much about everything. She understood perfectly well that her sister might not get married if she didn't want to. Goyo understood perfectly well that the main thing was that the Duke and Duchess O took care of Melissa. She understood perfectly well that they would not allow Melissa to be unhappy. Some time later, the Marquis approached the young lady and asked with a smile if she had spoken to her sister. Goyo sighed heavily and said that they had also spoken about her engagement, and that not everything was going so smoothly there. He looked closely at his wife and said that it seemed her sister had set the bar low. She smiled and said that she thought Melissa had made a good choice, as Tero was the best groom in the empire. The Marquis looked at his wife with a smile and said that it was because he was already married. The young lady was surprised and told her husband that he was very confident. She looked at him closely and said that she thought he was a good option, and it was not for nothing that he was considered the best groom. He looked at his wife intently and said that she should not judge a book by its cover, because what was inside was much more important. She looked closely at her husband and said with a grin that this was being said to her by a man who really loved luxurious clothes. The Marquis looked at his wife with a grin and said that he could certainly take off his clothes if she wished. He came closer to her and quietly whispered in her ear that under his clothes, everything was even more gorgeous. The young lady froze in shock, not knowing what to answer, but a moment later, she asked him in confusion what he was saying. He smiled, looking at his wife, and said that under this outerwear, he had the same chic clothes. She looked at him in surprise as she was very embarrassed. A moment later, she said that she had understood everything wrong. He looked at his wife with a smile and said that she blushed a little. Goyo looked away from her husband and said that she knew about it. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile why she was so cute. Goyo looked at her husband in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. A moment later, the Marquis tenderly kissed his wife in front of everyone, and Goyo reciprocated his feelings. Everyone looked at the Marquis family with surprise and attention. Since they did not expect this from the newlyweds, they whispered and said that it seemed that harmony reigned in their family. The young lady looked at her husband with embarrassment and said that people were looking at them. She was shocked as he, as always, attracted attention. The Marquis smiled and said that he really liked her confused expression. He looked at her with a smile and said that he was very sorry that this moment did not last longer. A moment later, they heard some noise behind them and turned around excitedly. Everyone looked intently at the Empress, who had just attended the event. It looked at the Empress, and since Tero and Melissa were next to her, the Empress looked at everyone present with a smile and said that they had good news for everyone present. Goyo looked away from them, as she did not want to look at this at all. The Marquis in turn looked sideways at his wife as he noticed her expression. But a moment later, he looked at her with a smile and tenderly took her hand. The young lady in turn looked at her husband with a smile. She was very glad that he supported her. She in turn wondered, before she got into the past, whether he treated Melissa as well as her. She sighed heavily because she knew that this was a very stupid question, because she knew what really happened, because in 6 months he would kill the entire Roubier family. The young lady in turn walked leisurely through the garden and enjoyed the beautiful flowers. Rajan walked up to the young lady and said with a smile that it was a very beautiful garden. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise as she didn't expect to see her at all. She looked at her with a smile and asked why she came without saying a word. Rajan said with a smile that she came for an interview with the Betelgeuse Knights. She smiled and told the Marquise that she had decided to come to her for a short while, and she also asked the Marquise if she would mind if she became a vassal of the Marquise's family. The Marquise smiled and said that she was not at all against it, and she would even be glad. Regina looked at the Marquise with a smile and thanked her, and also asked her to wish her success. The maid looked at her mistress with a smile and asked her if she thought she would be knighted. The Marquise thought for a moment and said that she didn't even know if she would be able to become a knight in their family. Goyo looked at her friend intently and asked if she thought the verdict would be positive. Rajan looked at the Marquise intently and said that there were few who would be able to refuse a capable person like her. The Marquise laughed. She looked at her friend with a smile and said then that was very good. The Marchioness told her friend that she wanted to ask her something. The Marchioness smiled and said that her husband's birthday was just around the corner. She sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, she didn't know what gift to choose for him. Regan looked at her friend thoughtfully and said that it was not such an easy task, since it was very difficult to surprise the Marquise with anything. She said that, in fact, she had never given gifts to men except for her brother. A moment later, she looked at her friend closely and said that it was a very good idea, and they could ask her brother. She smiled and said that he had just arrived at the mansion today. She understood that her brother could help them very well and ease the situation. After some time, the Marquis, looking intently at his wife, asked if he could come in. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. She puzzledly told her husband that he was very early today. Goyo P looked at her husband and said that they decided to go to Eliam's mansion since she would like to meet El. The Marquis looked at his wife with surprise and caution and asked what she was talking about. He looked closely at his wife and asked her what she wanted to talk about with El. He was very puzzled since his wife was going to meet another man, and she was also talking about it openly. The young lady in turn was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. She could not tell him that she was going to him to ask what kind of gift would be best to buy for her husband. She looked at her husband with a radiant smile and said that she just wanted to see him. Goyo knew that she could not tell him more, as she would have revealed her surprise to him. Regine looked at the Marquis intently and smiled, and told him not to worry about anything. She said that she would definitely return his wife to him by the evening. The Marquis, in turn, looked angrily at the young lady. He said with fury that he would send a carriage for them so that they could travel in it. Regan said with a smile that he should not worry so much at all, since they themselves could give their own carriage. He looked at her sharply and said that it would not do as he wanted, to make sure that he would not be dining alone. She looked at him closely and said with a smirk that he seemed to feel lonely a lot. The young lady looked at her husband intently and said that her friend was joking and he should not fall for such a thing. The Marquis froze in shock. He looked intently at his wife and asked what she was talking about. The young lady smiled, looking at her husband, and said that she would be back soon. He was perplexed, as he did not expect such a thing from his wife. He looked closely after his wife, who was leaving the estate in a hurry. Caleb looked at his master intently and asked if he wanted to confess to her. Yet the Marquis sighed heavily and said that he did not love her. He wondered what the reason for love was. He said that he did not have one. The Marquis sighed heavily and said embarrassedly that it seemed possible to fall in love without a reason. The Marquis froze in shock. He told himself that this couldn't be, and he didn't love her. He was confused and didn't understand what was wrong with him. The Viscount in turn looked intently at the gentleman and sighed heavily, since he was simply a fool, and could not even admit to himself that he loved her. Regine looked at the Marquise intently and asked her in a puzzled tone what she was thinking about. The young lady was taken aback and said with a smile on her face that she was not thinking about anything. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed her husband looked a little strange. She said she was wondering what was wrong, because she was very worried about him, and she didn't understand why he was suddenly so upset. Regine looked at her friend intently and asked if she really didn't understand Marquise. Looked at her friend in surprise as she didn't understand what was going on. Regine looked at the Marquise intently and said that the Marquise was jealous of her towards El Goyo. Z froze in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Regine looked at her friend with a smile and said that it was because the Marquise loved her very much. Goyo looked at her friend intently and said that it was definitely not that. The Marquise understood perfectly well that he could not think of such a thing. She knew he was just playing the role of a good husband. The lady looked at the Marchioness and asked with a smile how the dance had gone. She said that she had heard that Alt O had been announced to be engaged. She was surprised and did not understand what the young man was thinking when he made such an announcement while the Marchioness was also there. The Marquise sighed heavily and, looking sideways at her friend, said that they simply wanted to show everyone their place. She said that the royal family wanted to celebrate the reunion of Alta and Roubier, and in this way, they wanted to show their power. Regine looked at the Marquise in surprise and said that she was speaking as if it concerned her. The Marquise sighed heavily and said that it made her sad, as she was a little annoyed by the fact that she had run into her ex and that she and Melissa, living in the same house, had never really communicated. Goyo sighed heavily and said that Melissa had always felt awkward around her, but she was very young then, so she never resented her for it. She looked at the Marquise in surprise and asked why she thought the Marquise didn't love her. Reagan didn't understand why the Marquise didn't do obvious things. Goyo looked at her friend and said that she was the eldest daughter of the Rubiel family, and she was supposed to marry Betelgeuse, and if she married Alt Ansi, S would propose to Melissa, that's all. She said that, in other words, her husband would behave with Melissa in exactly the same way as he did with her. She looked hard at the Marquise and said, puzzled, that she did not think it was, as she said, since she had seen everything that was written on his face. The Marquise smiled, looking at her friend, and said that she knew that this was certainly so. Goyo thought for a moment, because in fact she felt greed. She understood that this was not right, but to her regret, she could not do anything about it. Goyo was puzzled because she realized that the more time they spent together, the more she wanted to become a little special for him. Goyo was shocked because this showed her greed, but she understood perfectly well that she could not even count on more. She knew that in such a situation, she could die with a smile on her face. The young lady thought for a moment, for she knew very well that she had no need to expect more, for she already knew her future very well. The lady looked at the Marchioness intently, as she was very much agitated. She would like to somehow console her, but unfortunately, she understood that everything was in vain. The Marchioness in turn looked at the lady, and with a smile said that everything was fine. She smiled and said that ever since she met her sister, she couldn't help but think about it. She said it was very strange. The lady looked at her friend closely and said that it wasn't so. And it was normal to think about it, after all, he was her husband. She looked at the Marquise with a smile and said that it was the first time she had heard her tell her something like that, and she was very glad that they had become a little closer. The Marquise looked closely at her friend, as she had not expected to hear something like that. Moments later, the Marquise looked at her friend with a smile and said that she reminded her a little of her husband. Regine was shocked, and looking at her friend, she asked how they were similar. The Marquise looked at her friend with a smile and said that they were similar. Because she was also strange, Regine was shocked by such a statement. Looking at her friend, she asked why she was strange and demanded from Goyo explanations. Goyo thought for a moment as she looked at her friend, as she had previously thought that she had ulterior motives when she said that she wanted to be friends with her. But now she didn't think of it that way, since she was going to die soon anyway. So she said that she didn't mind them becoming friends. She thought that she had been too irresponsible about this. The young lady looked at her friend, as she was now very comfortable and pleased to be with her. She wondered what her friend would feel when she died. She knew that she had become friends with her friend, because she knew that her days were numbered. She knew very well that it was very selfish of her. The young lady looked at her friend intently and asked for forgiveness. She looked at her with a smile and said that one day she would tell her everything. Goyo Yu smiled at her friend and said that she wished that after she told her everything, she would pretend that she didn't know anything. The young lady looked at her friend in bewilderment. She did not know how to react to these words. The Marquise in turn wanted only one thing when the time came. She wanted everyone to think that it was an accident. She wanted everyone to forget about the tragedy of the Betelgeuse family. Goyo wanted everyone to forget about her. The young man looked closely at the Marquise and thought with a smile about a birthday present for her husband. He asked why he shouldn't give her something she was good at doing. Elle looked at the Marquise with a smile and said that the best gift is a sincere gift that the Marquise can give to this. His sister looked at him in bewilderment and asked if this was all he could offer. Regine looked at her brother intently and said that they already knew that she was puzzled and did not understand why she brought the Marquise to the mansion. Then Elle looked at the young ladies puzzledly and asked for their forgiveness. The Marquise looked at the young man with a smile and said that he should not worry, since he had helped her a lot. She thought about what she could do for her husband. The young lady looked at the young men and said shyly that she needed their help. She asked if they could help her. The young people froze in place from shock and bewilderment, as they did not understand what the Marquise wanted from them. Exer looked at the Marquise intently and said that he could help her in his free time. Exer was a little puzzled and surprised, as he did not understand why he should try so hard when the master did not care about his birthday. Caleb, with lightning speed, interrupted his friend and said that the master would be very glad to receive a gift from the young lady. Exer looked at his friend intently and asked what he said wrong. Caleb looked at his friend intently and told him to shut up immediately. The young lady looked at the young men, who were quietly arguing in bewilderment. A moment later, they looked at the young lady with wicked grins. She looked at them intently and thanked them for their help, and also asked them to keep everything a secret from the Marquis. They looked at her intently and said that of course they would not tell the Marquis anything about this. She thanked them again and slowly left them. After the young lady left the young men, they looked at each other intently. They were a little puzzled and did not know how their master would react to this.